Hello, this is a guy who likes fanfiction and is too lazy to read, so here is Bloodlines of the Dragon in audio form. Check the description for the links to the author. Chapter 37. She didn't scream as she fell. He couldn't help but feel grateful. The nightmares were going to be bad enough already. He twisted, and used his free hand to grab the stone ledge. His ribs burned as he pulled himself up, hauling Caleb with him. Caleb was screaming Eli's name. He levered himself onto the bridge, and yanked Caleb the rest of the way to safety. Standing hurt. So did Caleb's fist when the other man punched him. Caleb shoved him, and then shoved him again. Logain let the other man drive him backwards a few steps. You dropped her. Caleb stared at him, and shoved him again. How could you drop her? Tears fell from Caleb's eyes. Why did you drop her? Logain spat a mouthful of blood onto the stone of the bridge. He met Caleb's eyes levelly, fixing the other man with a cold stare. Caleb dropped his own eyes first, and shook his head as if he could make what had just happened go away by the motion. Logain pushed the grief away. There would be time later to consider all that had just been lost. He heard Caleb's voice. Eli. The others are in trouble. Logain started walking towards the men that were coming in their direction, drawing his blade as he did so. Move, Hawk. Colin felt his jaw drop open as Carver's eyes went solid black. The man turned and charged at the oncoming Cunnery. One flung a spear. Carver caught it without missing a step, spun, and hurled it back without breaking stride. The spear went through the Cunnery and the Cunnery behind him, pinning both to the stone wall. And Carver's fist went through the armor of the next one in line. The elven man launched himself at the attackers coming from the south, spinning as the magical blade sliced through his opponents. He saw Sala's hands glow, and felt the tingling familiarity of a barrier on his skin. There would be time for questions later. He raised his shield and blocked an incoming spear from the Cunnery coming from the north, and moved in. There was a surge of something, and he felt 10 years younger. He parried an incoming blow far more easily than he should have. Several Cunnery came out of an alleyway, and lightning started arcing around Kieran, swirling as though he stood in the midst of a storm. He hurled spheres of lightning at the oncoming Cunnery, sending them flying in all directions. Colin spun, striking another Cunnery with his shield. A swath of ice caught some of his incoming attackers, sending some sliding to the ground and freezing 2 others in place entirely. He caught a glimpse of Sala raising a glowing staff above her head as she called hailstones out of the sky. Meanwhile, at the other end of the alley, Carver put his fist through the iron collar of a Sarbaz and landed atop the corpse. Another Cunnery charged at the man, and Carver simply grabbed him by the front of his armor and hurled him into a small group of other Cunnery before moving in to close. There was a sharp cracking noise as he did so, and he realized what it was a heartbeat later when Carver drove the horn through his next opponent's chest. The elven man's magical blade seemed to ignore the armor of his opponents, and as the Cunnery moved in to close he simply vanished to reappear behind them, glowing blades attacking from unexpected angles. He danced in and out of the fray, faster than the eye could see. One of the Cunnery hurled a spear at the elf's back, but he somehow moved aside from it anyway, letting it instead hit one of the other Cunnery. A battle axe came down at him with full force. Colin caught it on his sword almost effortlessly, and wasn't sure who was more surprised by that, him or the attacker. He shoved the axe to the side and ran the Cunnery man through. A quick look over the battlefield showed no other attackers left standing. The fight had to have taken time, and yet he felt no more winded than a quick walk up the main staircase of Skyhold. Anyone hurt? Sala asked. Commander Rutherford. I. Colin glanced down at his side and was almost surprised to find himself bleeding. From a wound that should have put him on the ground. Yes. She moved in and her fingers glowed white with healing magic. A heartbeat later the wound was gone entirely, with only the mark on his armor to show it had ever been there. Carver walked over, his hands coated with gore from where he'd taken on half a karatam with his bare hands. The strange inky blackness faded from his eyes. The storm had vanished from Kieran, and the blades disappeared from Tissalin's hands. Kieran's eyes suddenly narrowed as he turned to the west, and Colin heard him snarl. Kieran. Sala turned towards him. Eli's song is silent. Kieran narrowed his eyes. Logain is hurt. The others are in trouble. He turned to Sala. We need to hurry. She nodded. To Salin, make sure they get back safely. Abruptly 2 hawks were flying to the north. Tissalin made an annoyed noise, and gave the vanishing forms a disapproving look. That girl was slightly less trouble before she grew wings. Sala. Cullen stared. Did she just? He turned towards Carver. And you just? He glanced down at his sword. And I just? He swallowed. What just? Yeah. Carver nodded. He accepted a cloth Tissalin handed him, and began using it to wipe his hands clean. I suppose you are going to want an explanation, aren't you? Is this the right warehouse? Leandra asked Gavrin. I'm pretty sure. Gavrin hesitated, and then lifted his hand to knock on the door. There was silence. He lifted his hand to knock again, and then there was a scraping sound. The door opened, and an elven man with white tattoos was frowning at them. Gavrin swallowed. Fenris. He glanced at his companions and their prisoner. Commander Cullen said you had wounded. Wordlessly, Fenris stepped back to let them in and pointed at the nearby staircase. Gavrin and Kells immediately started in that direction. Leandra pulled their captive inside, and looked from the bound man to Fenris. Fenris shut the door behind her. This is... Leandra glanced at the prisoner again. Actually, we never got his name. Where should I put him? You would think after so many years of being with Hawk I would have lost my capacity for surprise. Fenris shook his head. Bring him this way. Agatha turned back towards the tunnel behind them. SHH. She held up a hand and the others fell silent. She heard the scraping sound again. Someone's coming. An elven woman, flanked by 2 men, stepped into view. Well. She smiled. What have we here? Jarath and Tryan immediately drew their weapons. Jarath stepped slightly in front of Duncan, raising his shield. Tryan did the same for Agatha. Duncan fitted an arrow to his bow. Agatha put her hands onto daggers. The woman shook her head and gave them a disapproving look. Such poor manners. She waved a hand. Hand over your weapons. Come get them. Duncan started to draw back his bow. Do not be foolish, child. She shook her head. You are behind a barrier. Nothing will pass through unless I allow it. Siofra, I presume. Tryan asked. She smiled. I am. And it appears I've caught nothing less than 2 kings in my little cage. She folded her arms. I said, hand over the weapons. And I said, come get them. Duncan glared. Ah. She looked over her shoulder at the man behind her. I think they are still waiting on their 3 little rescuers. The men behind her laughed. Unfortunately, I fear they will not be coming. She shrugged. They had a... She smirked. Falling out. They didn't make it. Her blood went a little cold. Loghain, Caleb, and Eli couldn't be dead. Next to her, Jarath's eyes narrowed as he shifted his grip on the sword. Duncan shook his head. You're lying. Duncan Thurin, son of Alistair, son of Merrick. She gave him an appraising look. Blood of Callanhood. She snorted. I expected something a little more. She shrugged. Impressive. No matter. You and the Dwarven Prince are of use to me. Her lips curled, revealing her teeth. Your 2 companions are not. Agatha saw Tryan lift his shield slightly higher in response to the implied threat. The Dwarven man shook his head. You have to take that barrier down to get to us, and you'll die the moment that happens. Siofra rolled her eyes. We'll see how much more cooperative they are feeling after a day without water. She gestured to the men to follow her out of the room. As soon as she was gone, Agatha started shaking her head. They can't be dead, right? Mafaroth's balls. Duncan shook his head. His grandfather died 6 years ago and was still able to lead us out of the deep roads. I won't believe a Mactier is dead until I've burned the corpse. He lowered his bow and put a hand on Agatha's shoulder. And even then I'll still have my doubts. The others are out there as well. Traian smiled reassuringly. It wasn't lost on her that Jarath remained quiet and wary. Loghain gutted the first of the men. One of Caleb's crossbow bolts caught another in the leg, and Loghain slammed his shield into him. He spun, and a backhanded blow from his sword sent the last man's head flying. He heard Caleb's footsteps as the other man caught up with him, and he continued to where the others were being held. "Get the cage open." He jerked his head at Caleb. The other man glared at him, but went into the room, pulling the key off his neck as he did so. Alone, he spat out another mouthful of blood. He pressed his hand against his ribs, and felt a jolt of pain as they moved beneath his hand. Breathing was starting to become difficult, and sparks were dancing at the edge of his vision. "I need a little longer. We aren't safe yet." He felt the pain fade, and some of the weariness leave his muscles. He could feel the tightness of his lungs, but the next breath came freely. The darkness receded, bringing his vision back into focus. He swallowed, and followed Caleb into the room, blade in hand. "Thank the Maker." Despite his words to Agatha, Duncan couldn't help but feel relief at the sight of Caleb. "They told us you were dead." Caleb roughly jammed the key into the lock. "Elias." He turned the key and jerked the door open. Agatha made a horrified gasp. "Eli." Duncan looked from Caleb to where Loghain had entered the room. The knight was bleeding, but gave him a nod. "What happened?" Jarath spoke before Caleb could reply. "We need to get moving. Siofra was just here, and she could be back any moment." He touched Agatha's shoulder, and she nodded in response, setting her face into determined lines. "The way out is clear." Loghain nodded. Caleb grabbed the key out of the lock as they headed out of the room. Duncan's eyes narrowed slightly as he caught the anger-filled look Caleb shot at Loghain. He frowned. Loghain's own face bore no expression, but he kept his eyes away from Caleb. Something had happened. He started to open his mouth to ask, and thought better of it. They could ask questions once they were back at the safe house. They were about halfway back when they ran into trouble. A dozen men, 2 of which had staffs, started pointing and coming their way, drawing weapons as they did so. He aimed an arrow at one of the mages, only to have it bounce off a barrier. The mage started to twirl his staff, and then a hawk grabbed the staff and yanked it out of his hands. "What the?" Traian started to say. A second hawk swooped into their midst, turning into Sala. She immediately sent a blast of ice at the oncoming problem. The other hawk dove back and turned into a bear, grabbing the still-armed mage and hurling him into the nearby building with a sickening crunch. Duncan shrugged, and aimed his bow at one of the swordsmen. Kells took the vial out of his tunic as he knelt next to Bruhan. As carefully as possible, he opened the stop. He shook a tiny bit of the ashes into his finger, and gently spread them across Bruhan's lips. Gavrin knelt on the other side, his fingers starting to glow white with healing magic. "What are you?" Hawk started to ask. Bruhan gasped, and shook his head. He rolled to one side, and started coughing. Gavrin immediately touched him with the glowing hands. "Bruhan?" he asked. "Maker's breath." Bruhan rubbed at his forehead. Vial in hand, Kells moved next to Lenore and repeated the process. Hawk moved to Lenore's side, catching her gently as she started to cough. Melavin went to assist Adralicus. "I would very much like an explanation." King Alistair folded his arms. "Where is my son, and where did you get?" His eyes widened. "That," he shook his head, "is slightly more than a pinch." "Pinch?" Bruhan blinked in confusion. "What's going?" He looked at the man next to him. "Gavrin. Commander Cullen and Lieutenant Carver are on their way. They just had to deal with some cunnery." Kells looked up at King Alistair. He glanced down at the vial in his hand, and then quickly offered it to King Alistair. He swallowed. "Lieutenant Carver told us to bring these here as fast as possible." King Alistair took the vial from him, and held it up to the light. He shook his head, and looked down at Bruhan. "You, Lenore, and Adralicus got yourselves poisoned." Fortunately, Carver managed to pull sacred ashes out of his ass. "That?" Lenore winced. "May be the single most sacrilegious statement I have ever heard someone utter." She sat up. And you are talking to Braska's wife. Sacred. Burhan looked up at the vial Alistair was holding. He uttered several elven phrases that had Gavrin choking and Melavin looking at him in shock. What now? Adralicus started looking around him. He stared at the vial. That's. The king went to his pack, and carefully tucked the vial away. I am not going to be the one to break that piece of news to Leliana. Nor am I. Burhan shook his head. Bastards. Lenore sighed. She looked around here again. That's Kells. Who? She turned her eyes to Gavrin. Gavrin, the Inquisitor's son. King Alistair turned towards where Leandra and Fenris were coming up the stairs, accompanied by the elven captive. And that's Leandra Hawk and Tissalan. That is not Tissalan. Melavin stood. Bahalan. Melavin. The man narrowed his eyes. Explain. King Alistair turned to look at Kells. Kells took a deep breath. We kind of ran into the Dread Wolf while attempting to regroup with the others. He apparently told Bahalan there to follow us, but Gavrin and Leandra got the drop on him. We were taking him back to our base when we ran into Commander Cullen and Lieutenant Hawk. And then Cunary attacked. They sent us on ahead while they took care of it. My little brother is fighting Cunary without me. Hawk sighed. He's going to pay for that. They may need help. King Alistair shook his head. We should go try to help them. Gavrin stood up. King Alistair put a hand on his shoulder and pushed him into a nearby chair. You three are not going anywhere. Hawk, Fenris. The two men immediately headed for the stairs. The king raised an eyebrow. And my boys are where? Kells winced. Don't actually know at the moment. Cullen wiped the blood from his blade and sheathed it before he began walking back towards the warehouse. An explanation would be welcome. Right. Carver nodded and fell into step behind him. Just kind of hard to know where to start. He shook his head. You know more than most. You know what Jaroth is, and that I work for him. I admit to being somewhat surprised you didn't phrase that in the past tense. Carver chuckled. Kirkwall is a bit of a trouble spot. Since we have people there, it made sense for Meryl and I to be the ones keeping an eye on things. Several of your former companions are still part of the Inquisition. Cullen narrowed his eyes. Of course they are. The Inquisitor and the Inquisition are at the heart of things, and you need all the help we can give you. Carver sighed. Cullen, you knew who we were. Jaroth is the one that asked you if they could stay with the Inquisition. Cullen made a frustrated sound. You. He shook his head. Are you an abomination? No. I'm supposed to believe you? After seeing that. Cullen gestured back behind him. You put your fist through 2-inch thick steel. I'm not an abomination. Carver growled. This is one of the reasons we don't. He sighed. It's too easy to be misunderstood. I'm not an abomination, at least not in the way you mean the term. I'm not possessed. I just. He spread his hands. I carry a piece. A piece. Cullen raised an eyebrow. A tiny fraction of the whole, but enough. He sighed. Cullen, I serve a living God. We have a duty to him. And he has given us what we need to fulfill that duty. Cullen caught Carver's arm, and stopped. Vague comments aren't good enough. Carver turned back towards Cullen. He took a deep breath. Jaroth is a creature of the Blight, and we have to account for that. That means. His face became pained. Being a warden isn't enough, not for what he is, not anymore. So he gave those he trusted most just enough, in case. He met Cullen's eyes. In case we need to kill a god. In case. Cullen closed his eyes for a long moment. In case the warden falls. We are bound to him. Perhaps that alone will be enough to stop it from happening, but in case it's not. Carver shook his head. Then it is our duty to kill the best friend most of us ever had, the finest man I have ever known. Because that is what he has asked of us. He shook his head. It is a duty and a burden we took willingly, knowing full well what it meant. And we keep it secret because... His lips twisted into a bitter smile. Because the alternative is for the world to look at us the way you are looking at me right now. Colin tore his eyes away. Maker. He gave us our abilities. Carver lifted his head proudly. We serve him, trying to save the world as best we can, and we will die when he does. Colin took a deep breath. All right. He blinked. When? What? You said? Colin frowned, and met Carver's eyes. You said you will die when he does. A small price. Carver smiled. Paid gladly. But he's... Colin shook his head. He can't die. He can. Carver nodded. And he will. Whatever else we have become. Carver squared his shoulders. The duty cannot be forsworn. The Inquisitor needs to know this. Colin nodded slowly. Beyond that, I will keep this secret. He blinked, and turned towards the man who had been watching them both silently. Tissalin shrugged. I am fairly confident the god I am sworn to knows all this already. He gestured. We should get a move on, before one of your children trips over a fachin. Do I even want to know what a fachin is? Colin started walking towards the warehouse again. No. Sala focused her energy into healing magic. She faded the abrasions on her brother before moving to Trian. His ribs were bruised. Jaroth gestured to Loghain, and she headed for him next. Her eyes widened when she delved the spell into him. She counted 4 broken ribs and a punctured lung, as well as damage to the muscles in both his shoulders, a fractured leg, several bones broken in his hand, and a lot of internal bleeding. Men had died from far less. How are you still upright? Hate, mostly. Loghain's voice was hard. A lie. She sighed. I'm sorry. She let the healing magic flow into him. Duncan turned towards Kieran. Any sign of Gavrin and his team? He is with your folks. We need to get there as well. Agatha raised an eyebrow. What? Bryn, Lenore, and Adralicus were poisoned. Sala turned towards them. Colin and Uncle Carver were attacked by Cunary. We left Tissalin with them to get them back to the warehouse safely. She shook her head. Not that Uncle Carver really needs the help. Mama was poisoned. Agatha stared. That's why we need to get to them. Sala nodded. They could be in trouble. We. Trian slowly shook his head. Need to go rescue them. 04. Duncan rubbed his forehead, then frowned. A lie, can we? He turned to Loghain. What happened? He killed her. Caleb's voice was harsh. Caleb. Loghain sighed. What? Caleb shook his head. That's what happened, isn't it? You had her, and you let her go. He gestured back towards the bridge. He had her, and he let her fall to her death. That fucking bastard dropped her. Loghain. Duncan turned towards the knight. What is he talking about? The bridge exploded. I managed to. Loghain closed his eyes, and then opened them before meeting Duncan's eyes. I let a lie go. He killed her. Caleb clenched his fists. Fuck, Loghain. Agatha glared. She was one of us. How could you? You think I wanted to? Loghain drew himself up. You think I'm happy about this? That I'm not going to see her face every night for the rest of my life? Why did you drop her? Caleb shouted, stepping forward. Because you had the fucking key. Loghain stepped forward as he shouted back. Because. Caleb touched the key that was again hanging around his neck. The key. I couldn't pull you both up. Loghain looked down and shook his head. He waved a hand before looking back up at Caleb. His voice was tired as he continued. The enemy was moving in to finish us off, the others were in trouble, and you had the key. What was I supposed to do, Caleb? Tell me. You were supposed to. Caleb choked on the words. Kieran exchanged a look with Sala, and she nodded. She moved to her brother as Kieran moved to Loghain, pulling the two men apart gently. We need to get to our folks. She glanced back at Duncan. Right. He nodded, and gestured. The warehouses are this way. Back so soon? Alistair looked down the stairs when he heard the door open. Hawke and Fenris entered, followed by Cullen, Carver, and an elven man he didn't recognize. Hawke shrugged. They apparently took care of the cunnery. He shot a glare at his brother. Without leaving any for us, and we're most of the way back already. Everyone all right? Alistair frowned. Both Carver and Cullen had blood on their armor. We are fine. Cullen nodded. We got some healing from Sala. Fenris blinked. Sala. He turned towards Cullen. She's not with you. You. Cullen sighed. Might want to sit down. He glanced up at Alistair, then gestured to the elven man. This is Tissalan. Nice to finally meet you. Alistair gestured for them to come up the stairs. Likewise. Tissalan gave him a polite nod. As soon as they were up the stairs, Hawke turned towards his brother. Now, why isn't your niece with you? Because she turned into a bird and flew away. Carver spread his hands. For a moment, Hawke stared at him. Then he rubbed his forehead. Let's try this again. Where is my daughter? He is unfortunately telling the truth. Cullen shook his head. She and Kieran swooped in to help us against the cunnery. Then she told Tissalan here to get us back to the warehouse safely. Cullen rolled his eyes. Before turning into a hawk and flying off with Kieran. She finally managed it. Gavrin asked excitedly. He swallowed and looked down at his feet when they all turned to stare at him. What part of, grounded for the rest of your natural life, are any of you failing to understand? Hawke shook his head. We did all right. Leandra folded her arms defiantly. We even captured an agent of the Dread Wolf. You guys didn't manage that. She smirked. You guys barely managed to learn of the cult's existence, and we found their secret bases. You didn't know about the Sentinels. We found them. We've managed to keep ahead of the cult, the Dread Wolf, the Cunnery, and you. Gavrin nodded. Discovered who was behind the cult, what they wanted, and how they managed the entire time warping thing in the first place. They both glanced at Kells, who started shaking his head. You kidnapped me. And we also kidnapped the spymaster of the Inquisition. Leandra nodded. Tissalan coughed lightly into his hand. Leandra shot a glance his way before moving to stand shoulder to shoulder with Gavrin. We rescued the Prince of Starkhaven, stole a ship out from under the Queen of the Eastern Seas, and ran circles around the Seekers. We are not children. Gavrin folded his arms, matching Leandra's stance. Father. Leandra stared at Carver. You know what was in that safe house. Look me in the eye and tell me we weren't meant to do this. Alistair turned towards him. Carver, you have something to add. Carver sighed. We. Slowly a smile came to his face. Our awesome parents. Chapter 38. Before we go any further. Alistair held up his hand, and looked at Tissalan. Do you happen to know where my son is? Your son is Duncan. Tissalan raised an eyebrow. Yes. Kieran and Sala have gone to retrieve them and the others. Tissalan took a deep breath, and turned to Melavin. Ir Abellas, Lethalin. Alidin Naden. Melavin sank into the chair behind him. He hung his head, and sighed. Mithilgalan, Viren asked. Ali's dead. Leandra put a hand over her mouth. How? Gavrin's voice was hollow. I do not know. Tissalan shook his head. Kieran knew when it happened. I am sorry for your loss. Alistair swallowed. If an elven sentinel had fallen, what did that mean for what his boys were facing out there? We need. He shook his head. We need to end this before more people get hurt. There is an Elovian. Kells spoke up. Kells. Leandra hissed at him. It could be a trap. Gavrin shook his head. It is not. Bahalan spoke from where he had been tied to a chair. Step through the Elovian, and it will take you safely to Kirkwall. He has given his word. Yes, because he's never broken that before. Tissalin rolled his eyes. Penshra, Herellen. Bahallan spat several more phrases in Elvish. Any of that we need to worry about. Alistair glanced at Bruhan. It was Gavarin who replied. He called Tissalin and Melavin traitors and a few other nasty names, accused them of being slaves to humans, said they were turning their back on all the elven people truly are, and that they deserved nothing more or less than to die forgotten. You speak Elvish? Bruhan raised an eyebrow at him. Why is everyone surprised that the Dread Wolf's apprentice speaks Elvish? Leandre glanced at Gavarin. She gestured at Bahallan. Can I punch him? I want to punch someone, and he's begging to be punched. No punching. Alistair shook his head. Once they got to the warehouse district, Kieran took the lead. He reached an alley, and started to go down it. Wait. Duncan shook his head. Are we? Jaroth sighed, and then put him into a headlock and started dragging him towards the building. He heard Agatha's amused laughter as Duncan started struggling to free himself, or at least put a halt to the forward motion. Jaroth ignored his king's orders to release him that instant. When they reached the door, he nodded to Sala. Mind knocking? Sala took a deep breath, and started to knock on the door. She'd managed to tap it once before it opened and Hawk stepped out. He grabbed her, and picked her up in a massive hug. Sala. He put her down before moving to Caleb and repeating the gesture, just as Fenris grabbed Sala and pulled her into the building. He didn't release Duncan until they were all in the building and the door was closed behind them. Duncan promptly tried to punch him. Duncan! King Alistair's voice rang out. A moment later the man had pulled Duncan into a tight embrace. Thank the Maker you're all right. He held Duncan for a long moment. Then he let him go, and to Jaroth's surprise, grabbed him, hugging him just as tightly. You're both all right. He stepped back, then grabbed both of them and started dragging them up the stairs. I am going to strangle both of you. He saw Lenore holding Agatha, and was pretty sure both women were crying. Hawk was holding onto his son as though he never intended to let him go again. Gavarin and... Over here. He heard Gavarin's voice and him and Leandra sitting at a table with Cullen and Carver. Are you all right? The king started to let them go, and then apparently reconsidered and dragged them both to chairs first. You've been wounded. Lenore. Sala already fixed us up. Duncan shook his head. Sala pulled free of her father, and caught Loghain's arm. She half-dragged the man to a chair. Sit. She poked him. Stay. She looked up at Lenore. He took a lot of damage earlier, and he's not to do much moving around for the next few hours. Lenore's fingers glowed white as she touched Loghain. Immediately she started shaking her head. Maker, Sala, you let him walk here in that condition. Jaroth frowned. How hurt is he? I've buried men in better shape. Lenore shook her head, and continued working her magic. Sala has already dealt with most of it, but he's out of action for the next few days at least. What the hell happened? Alistair started looking at them. He growled. No, explanations can wait. All of you, sit down, get your wounds tended, get something to eat, get cleaned up, and... He took a deep breath. Do not leave our sight. Dorian entered, followed by Arendaw. You found them. Cullen shook his head. They found us. He gestured to where the kids were sitting in the other half of the room, looking somewhat subdued. Eli's death had clearly shaken them. Melavin had withdrawn since hearing the news. Caleb had found the supplies, and was busying himself making food. Hawk kept moving from room to room trying to keep an eye on both his children. Cullen might have felt the need to tease the man, if he'd been willing to let Gavarin out of his sight for more than a few seconds. On the other side of the room, Adralicus had been staring at Kieran for the last half hour, eyes wide. Kieran had slowly been moving away from him. At one point, Adralicus had tried to close the distance, but a glare from Tissalin had sent the Magister scurrying back to his chair. Arendaw glanced at Adralicus, then her eyes flicked to Kieran. That's... She took a deep breath and collected herself. What happens now? Duncan must have heard the question, because he turned towards her. Now we go finish off this cult and its pet demon. Now, you and the rest of the children get on the griffins and get back to Kirkwall. Or Denerim. I think I prefer Denerim. Alistair glared at his son. We've come too far for that. Duncan stood. If we leave now, the cult will fade back into the shadows and come hunting us again, and we'll lose our best chance to take them down. He's right. Sala squared her shoulders. We know where they are, and have the best chance of dealing with them. Perhaps you missed the part where the Dread Wolf is in town. Hawk shook his head. All the more reason why you should let Gavrin and Kieran stay and help. They've proved to be the best options for dealing with his agents. Carver does fairly well. Cullen glanced at where the man was sitting. Carver. Carver sighed. Thinks she has a point. Hawk turned towards his brother. You cannot be serious. Alistair shook his head. No. Get your griffins, and get the kids out of here. We'll call out for reinforcements, and deal with the situation. I'm not going back to Kirkwall. Duncan shook his head. We are going to see this through. Alistair stepped towards his son. You are getting on that griffin if I have to tie you to the saddle. He turned his eyes towards Jarath. You are supposed to be keeping him out of trouble. He shook his head at both of them. And you are both going to explain things to your mothers. I am 30, Jarath said calmly. What? I am 30. He met Alistair's gaze levelly. I haven't explained anything to my mother in well over a decade. We aren't children. Duncan folded his arms. Jarath is a general. I have been king of Ferelden, king in a time of war, for 6 years. I do not take orders. I give them. I have faced demons and dragons, assassins, and ambassadors. Gavrin and Leandra have been handling situations like this one for years. Loghain hunts demons for sport. He stared at his father. And father, you are absolutely the last person in the world with the right to lecture anyone on running off to Tevinter to deal with a threat against family. That was. Alistair gestured in frustration. Different. How? Sala asked, her voice blunt. There were. Alistair sighed weakly. Dragons. Jarath killed one of those back in Nessum. Leandra raised an eyebrow pointedly. And there were crows. Such as the ones that recently poisoned several of the people in this room. Agatha gestured. It just was. My father instructed me to deal with this situation. Kieran clasped his hands behind his back. I will not be leaving until I have accomplished that task. Now listen. Alistair turned towards him. Light gleamed behind Kieran's eyes. King Alistair, my father holds you in high regard, and I share his opinion. His voice deepened slightly. But do not forget to whom you are speaking. The room went silent. Sala moved to stand next to Kieran. We are your children, and you taught us well. She smiled. So how, exactly, do you think you are going to be able to stop us? What would you do, if you were us? Gavrin stared at his father. Would you run? Duncan folded his arms. Would you? Agatha turned to her mother. Would you? Caleb looked at Bruhan. They mean in the opposite direction. Sala turned back to her fathers. A curious feeling. Fenris rubbed his forehead. Being so proud of your daughter you want to lock her in a closet for the rest of her life. Hawk put an arm around his husband's shoulders. That would be the one. Cathiel stared down at the message crystal in her hand. Braska's eyes were slightly wide, and he looked prepared to dive under cover. Our eldest son said what, exactly? One moment. Her husband's voice replied. There was a murmur of voices, and then a voice that sounded very similar to her husband's came over the crystal. Mother. Duncan. She narrowed her eyes. You are knowingly and willfully putting yourself into danger. A hazard of being both Thurin and Kausland. Give me one good reason why I shouldn't get on the back of a griffin and drag you home to Ferelden by your ear. Wyn, Bryce, and Merrick need their mother. Duncan's voice softened. I am trying to ensure they have her for as long as possible. She clutched the crystal tightly in her hand, and felt tears well in her eyes. Don't you dare get yourself killed trying to protect your father and I. Don't you dare. She felt Nijera's hand on her shoulder. Don't you. Mother, I. She heard him swallow. I will do what I have to do, as you taught me. For my family, and for Ferelden. Nijera's voice was slightly raw. Is Jarath there with you? A different voice came over the crystal. I am here. Don't. Nijera's shoulders shook slightly. I want, very much, to get the chance to meet you. Please, be safe. I will try. She felt a tug, and looked down. Slowly she knelt, and held the crystal to Win. Say hi to your brothers. Dunk. Win yelled into the crystal. Win. Papa. Win looked at the crystal in confusion. I want Duncan chair. Maker, I forgot you used to call Jarath that. Duncan's voice shook with laughter. Papa, where's Dunk? Dunk will be home soon, Win. Everything is going to be fine. You'll see. He was quiet for a moment. And I promise, this time around, I'll find you a sane husband. No husband. Ick. Win glared at the crystal. Don't change, Win. So the Dread Wolf has put in a personal appearance. Leliana held the crystal as she paced back and forth. He spoke with Gavrin, offered the kids a ride back to Kirkwall. Melavin, Tissalan, and Kieran all seemed to be of the belief that the offer was genuine and that Fenharil does not want to see any of the kids harmed. Burhan's voice replied. However, he did attempt to put a tail on Gavrin, Leandra, and Kells. Gavrin noticed, and they were able to capture the agent. Have you questioned him? Not far. He's been willing to give us information on the cult, though we already have most of what he has given us. He has refused to answer any questions regarding Fenharil or his activities. And the Cunnery. As near as we can tell, there were a couple survivors from the group that the kids encountered on the plains. They got in touch with some of their agents, and reinforcements were sent. Burhan sighed. No doubt more will be incoming, and as near as we can tell, the individual that sold the wine to Adralicus was a crow. I'm glad there were healers present. Leliana looked down at the crystal. The thought of losing him again tore at her. When he did not respond, she frowned at the crystal. Burhan. Our recovery was slightly more complicated than that. He sounded as though every word was being dragged out of him. Burhan. She narrowed her eyes. The warden's people had a safe house here, one that Carver claims they last used just before you called the Exalted Council. Burhan took a deep breath. One stocked with the right gear for the kids and a vial containing a small amount of ashes. Ashes. She blinked. Ashes. Ashes. I am guessing by small amount, you are not talking about a pinch. Thimbleful or so. We were with him. He took a pinch. She glared. I was there. I recall. He. She forced herself to breath, in and out. And has Carver told you what he has done with the urn? No. Has he given any explanation? No. Did you ask Kieran? Yes. And? I was told he hadn't checked that part of the codex, but it had been fully unlocked and I was more than welcome to do so if I desired. I attempted to ask him about this codex. Burhan's voice became slightly confused. Which seemed to frustrate him, as he claimed I had written several of the codex entries. Then he told me I needed to fix my spelling errors and amend several of the entries because they didn't match the information in the compilations even after accounting for the differing canon. Leliana stared at the crystal. I am unable to make any sense of that. Glad I'm not the only one. He set up a safe house for the kids that contained exactly what was needed to save you. Leliana rubbed her forehead. Years ago. She sat on the edge of her desk. How could they possibly have? I tried asking Kieran that as well. And I gave up somewhere around Illusion of the contrapuntal harmonies with the ambient theme. I understand every single word he used and I have absolutely no idea what he was talking about. Burhan made a vexed noise. So I went with, Mithil did it, and he said that was close enough. He sighed. Duncan tried to warn me. Kells looked up when he saw the commander enter. He'd been dreading this moment. The thought of facing the commander's disappointment almost made him wish he'd let the dragon eat him. Sir, He took a deep breath. I know you are angry, and Kells. Cullen shook his head. I have spent the past couple months worried sick about you and Gavrin. Yes, I'm furious. I understand. Gavrin is your son, and I let Kells. Cullen's voice was sharp. When Kells flinched, Cullen sighed. Yes. Gavrin is my son. He smiled. And you are my brother. He took a deep breath. So yes, I am furious. Two people I love dearly were in trouble, and I too far away to protect them. Sir, If either of you ever do anything like this again, I will. Cullen put both hands on Kells's shoulders and met his eyes levelly. Personally make you both run drills until you drop before sticking you on latrine duty for the rest of your natural lives. Do you understand me? He felt tears in his eyes. Yes, sir. Cullen pulled him into a hug. Cetadel looked down at the crystal. I have been worried sick about you. She shook her head. Do you realize how much more gray hair the last few weeks have given me? I am sorry. Trian's voice responded. She wanted to reach through the crystal and hug him. Or strangle him. Or both. Your mother is frantic. If it wasn't for your siblings, she'd be on a griffin and there right now. You do realize just how much she sacrificed for you. I do. That's. Trian sighed. That is why I am here. What we owe to the warden. All those years, back in Orzammer. Zerlinda practically fussing over Jaroth every time he got within 50 feet of her. The look on her face when she'd learned Jaroth had suggested Cetida adopt Trian in the first place. She should have considered how Trian would feel about the appearance of Jaroth's son. Considering the tattoo on his face, young Loghain likely felt the same way. I understand. She sighed. I am furious, but I understand. I have to see this through. Her eyes closed. She bowed her head, and then reopened them. I know. And. The corner of her mouth lifted. I am proud of you. You were told to lay down. Loghain glanced over his shoulder at the sound of Carver's voice. He shook his head. I did that already. I think they meant for you to stay laying down. Carver stepped into the small office that was serving as a bedroom, and closed the door behind him. Are you all right? Define all right. He flung the towel back down on the washstand. I'll live. Should be good for combat again by morning. Lenore says you're to remain in the bed for the next few days. Carver glanced back at the door. We're going to need to come up with an explanation for why you heal so fast. I was going to resort to my usual standby of, it's complicated, and then making a pass. Loghain sat heavily on the edge of the bed. Yeah, that last part. He shrugged. It's Lenore, she might call your bluff. Who is bluffing? Loghain looked down at his hands. He rubbed his palm with the other hand, and then clenched his fists. I wasn't strong enough to pull them both up. You had busted ribs. Carver sighed. It's nothing short of miraculous you caught either of them in the first place. He grabbed a chair, and sat down, folding his arms and setting them on the chair back as he looked at Loghain. I can sit here and tell you I would have done the same thing, but given that Caleb is my nephew that comes off a little hollow. Going to be a while before he stops hating me. He's smarter than that. Carver shook his head. Give him some credit. She was special. Loghain sighed. Stupid of me, right? But she was. He set his hands next to him. She deserved better. That's the way it works, isn't it? Carver shook his head. And that's why we fight. But it's never easy. He leaned back, folding his hands on the chair back. How'd your father take you joining up? I told him I'd decided to join the Templar Order. Loghain managed a smile. Then, after he stopped glowing, I told him the truth. Yeah. Carver shook his head and smiled. Something tells me you fit in just fine. He stood. Let me know if you need anything. He started towards the door. Carver. He turned back to Loghain. Loghain looked up at him. 4 days before we ended up 16 years into the past, the warden paid me a visit. He knew this was going to happen. Carver slowly nodded. And he needed to let it. He said it was a chance he was going to have to take. Let it happen, and hope that the Kieran of the here and now could fix things. He took a deep breath. And he told me the first thing I needed to do when I got here was send a message to him telling him not to get involved. To let things play out. So that's why he hasn't answered you. Good to know. Carver shrugged. Stupid to worry, but I was starting to. Did he tell you what all Kieran needed to fix? No. Loghain shook his head. And I did ask. He said he trusted Kieran to figure it out. Then we backed Kieran's play. Carver put his hand on the doorknob. Not that we ever had any other option. How exactly are we going to do anything about this staff if he can't even remember it exists? Lenore folded her arms. We. Gavrin sighed. Are still working on a solution to that particular problem. But we now know what the staff looks like and who has it. Sala waved a hand. And Kieran reacted enough to its presence to make it clear that's the one we are looking for. I did. Kieran glanced at her. You did. He shrugged. So all we need to do is get it into his hands, and he can take it from there. Gavrin nodded. Except it's in the hands of this Siofra. I would be a lot more confident if this in any way resembled a real plan. Cullen leaned back in his chair. Carver turned towards him. Cullen, have you ever seen what happens to a plan when my brother gets within 100 feet of it? We took Adamant with him present. A pseudo-archdemon appeared, the Inquisitor ended up physically in the Fade, and Loghain became a spirit. Cullen sighed. Concede the point. Hey. Hawk shook his head. I resemble that remark. It is not only Hawk. Kieran shook his head. Right. Your son is the one who was in Navarra for half an hour and physically ran into Cassandra. Hawk folded his arms. I'm never going to live that down, am I? Gavrin glanced at Leandra, who shook her head and smiled. In all fairness, it was Agatha and Loghain who managed to find the tavern in Hasmel that contained me. Bruhan shrugged. You are the protagonists. You warp the nature of causality by your very presence. Probability bends, rendering the improbable not only possible but likely, swirling in reaction to your natures as the plot ebbs and flows around you. Your actions affect the outcome just as your choices affect the narrative, but you are drawn inexorably to the inevitable. Once the game begins, you are the only ones that can win. Kieran spread his hands. Did that make sense to anyone else? Alistair raised an eyebrow. Can you explain your explanation? Bruhan asked Kieran, his voice somewhat hesitant. Kieran nodded. Yes. You affect the odds, making the improbable plausible through the willing suspension of disbelief. Can you explain your explanation of your explanation? I will try. Kieran tilted his head, and then smiled. There are, in this world, hundreds of thousands of Dalish. He pointed to Bruhan. And then there is you, the Dalish elf that has risen to become spymaster of the Inquisition, in service to the Andras Tien Chantry. There are, in this world, a few hundred surviving elves from the time of Arlathan. Consider, if you would, the sheer implausibility of the simple truth of what has occurred here. He smiled, and gestured at Tissalan. That the most unlikely of Dalish elves would be the direct male line descendant of an ancient elf that has chosen to join our cause. There was silence. Tissalan and Bruhan stared at each other. Okay. Lenore rubbed her forehead. Maker, I can't even begin to do the math involved there. It sounds like one of Varric's stories. Hawk shook his head. Precisely. Kieran nodded to Hawk. That is just a little bit awesome. Caleb smiled. Bruhan shook his head. I need a drink. And a haircut. Tissalan's lips twitched slightly. Chapter 39. Bruhan started towards the room that held the prisoner. He was halfway down the hall before he turned to find Sala a couple paces behind him, and Tissalan a pace behind her. He shook his head, and looked at Sala. Where do you think you are going? To question the prisoner. He stared at her. Exactly why do you think you get to come do that? My team caught him. She folded her arms. You do realize I'm the professional here. My team caught you too. She smiled. I am not going to argue with you. Good. She walked past him and continued down the hall, Tissalin at her heels. A low growl escaped him as he started after them. He quickened his pace to reach the door before Sala, and blocked her path. Have you ever handled an interrogation before? I interrogated Melavin. That. Burhan shook his head. Was not an interrogation. He glanced at Tissalin. Tissalin shrugged. I could make a case in either direction. It starts to be a problem, you leave. Burhan narrowed his eyes at Sala. He opened the door and stepped inside, followed by the other two. Tissalin took a position leaning beside the door. The prisoner immediately sent a glare at him before looking back to Burhan and sneering. Burhan folded his arms. Bahalan. Is it time for yet another round of you asking me questions I have no intention of answering? Bahalan leaned back in the chair he had been tied to. You do realize you won't be permitted to keep me much longer. We have one of the warden's Elevians. Sala smiled. I admit to being slightly curious as to where exactly Earthamil can send you. If he wasn't mistaken, the prisoner actually flinched slightly at the threat. Maybe letting her in hadn't been a terrible idea. Bahalan glared at her. I'm supposed to fear a little Shemlin pretending to be a... There was a slight hesitation when his eyes caught the staff Sala wore on her back. Mage? I know what real magic looks like. Where is Fenharil now? Burhan moved to stand just out of the prisoner's line of sight, forcing the man to be able to look at only one of them at a time. It is not as if you would even be able to comprehend the answer to that question. Bahalan smirked. Which probably means he is in Rive Island. Tissalin twitched a shoulder. I believe that area is within the forest you call the Donarchs on your maps. Bahalan twisted towards him and spat a curse. You side with these Banal Vihen over your own people. Be more polite when speaking of my great-great-grandson. The corner of Tissalin's mouth lifted slightly. He fought the urge to snicker at the confused look on Bahalan's face. Can you get us to Rive Island? Burhan raised an eyebrow at Tissalin. He would not leave those Elevians undefended, and I doubt the path have grown less dangerous with time. Tissalin shook his head. Burhan leaned on the wall, and looked over Bahalan's head at Tissalin. What do you think the Dread Wolf will do? Some things must be preserved if he is to accomplish his goal. No doubt, he seeks to bring those things into his power and ensure they survive the chaos that will ensue with the destruction of the Veil. Tissalin furrowed his brow. There will also need to be places of safety for his people, where he can be reasonably assured of their survival. Though he will sacrifice them if he must. He will not turn on us. And how is Falasin these days? Tissalin raised an eyebrow at Bahalan before turning his eyes back to Burhan. He seeks out the old places, searching for what will give him the best chance of success, both in the destruction of the Veil and the battle that will come after. Tissalin frowned. Which is undoubtedly why he does not challenge the warden. Explain that. Burhan raised an eyebrow. The destruction of the Veil will free the Evanuris. I doubt long years of captivity have improved their disposition. Fenharil will need his help to defeat them, and the warden will have little choice but to give it, if he wishes to protect any part of the world. Why oppose him? Bahalan glanced at Tissalin before turning back to Burhan. You Dalish claim you wish to preserve the past. What is that oath of yours? Never submit. And here you are, bending knee to Shemlin. Why would you side with them? How can you oppose him? Don't you understand what he is trying to do? He would restore Arlathan. Fuck Arlathan. Tissalin's voice was angry. Burhan and Sala both blinked as they turned their eyes towards him. I almost understand why some of the Dalish have chosen to follow. They cling to the faded memory of a dream that never was, but you and I, Bahalan. We were there. We know better. He shook his head, and laughed bitterly. Fuck Arlathan. I want a better world. Silence descended on the room. For just a moment, Burhan dared to hope. And then Bahalan shook his head. I will not turn on him. I believe you. Tissalin shook his head. He looked up at Burhan. And he wouldn't trust a fool like this with anything useful anyway. Gavarin lay back on the pallet, staring up at the ceiling. He took a few deep breaths, and then willed himself asleep and across the veil. The city spread out before him, shifting and changing as it reflected different periods of time. Shadows and images danced across the ages as memories echoed. Calling spirits here can be dangerous. A voice spoke from behind him. Too many here have been abused. Gavarin turned towards the speaker. Salas nodded. I thought I might find you here. You have acquired one of my agents. He is unharmed. Gavarin shrugged. A bit annoyed, but unharmed. I would like him released. I would like not to be followed. Gavarin smiled. A reasonable request, though one I cannot grant. Salas spread his hands. Then he sighed. My agents recovered Eli's body. Thank you. Gavarin nodded, and blinked tears away from his eyes. We were concerned when we did not find her. Kiran had been certain she was dead, but part of him felt like that last little hope had been crushed. Melavin will be relieved. I can only hope you have learned from this, and reconsidered my offer to return you to Kirkwall. Salas shook his head. Delenn, whatever is to come, your mother is important to me and I will not have her grieve your loss. If I must use force to see you safely from this place, that is exactly what I will do. And there it is, Harin. Gavarin smiled. That part of you that lets us still have hope. He shook his head. What does the Formless One want with Duncan and I? As formidable as high dragons are, the great dragons are another manner of beast altogether. And we are in a land that once worshipped dragons as gods. Salas gestured at the city. He would covet such a creature, as either weapon or host. Some have woken, or will, years yet from now. One kills Rainier. He killed it back. A small smile came to Salas's face as he acknowledged Gavarin's words. It would take a great dragon. He nodded. Callanhood's bloodline carries the blood of the dragons. Any of the bloodline can wake them. Then why specifically Duncan? Gavarin frowned. I've met his sister. He is not the most dangerous Thurin, and one of the twins is a mage. But Duncan is the one completely immune to the blight. Well. Gavarin blinked. That's something. Why? I do not know. I suspect it has something to do with the magic that was used to ensure his birth. The Formless One's interest in Kiran is obvious. He met Salas's eyes. Why me? I imagine his interest bears some similarity to mine. Salas gave him an appraising look. Your mother said I come to Skyhold to save you, but you have made it clear I put considerable effort into educating you. Your potential is. He shrugged. Astonishing. He clasped his hands behind his back. It is conjecture only, but I believe he would desire you as his host. Not a comforting thought. And all the more reason you should be safely away from him. Go back to Kirkwall, Delenn. Are you forgetting they already got to us in Kirkwall? Gavarin shook his head. That's what started this in motion. Salas sighed, and then nodded. Then I will make you an offer. You and Duncan come with me. I will protect the two of you until our allies have dealt with the Formless One. Once that is done, I will return you both safely to your respective families. I will take your offer to Duncan. Gavarin sighed. As much as he hated to admit it, the others would have a better chance of acquiring the staff if they were able to draw Salas away from the field. Thank you, Salas. Tell. Salas sighed. It does not matter. He would not listen. I expect my agent to be released by morning. Wake, Delenn. I'm immune to the blight. Duncan raised an eyebrow. He's immune to the blight. Alistair turned to Lenore. As unintended side effects of experimental magic go, that's a pretty good one. Lenore smiled. I'm awesome. Why is no one else concerned that the Dread Wolf keeps dropping in on Gavarin? Tryan asked. Gavarin's kind of used to it. Leandra shrugged, and seated herself in Gavarin's lap. I can't deny it's a good trait to have, but why would the Formless One care? Duncan raised an eyebrow, then frowned when he saw Carver and Kiran exchange a look with each other. Kiran. Many of my father's abilities are drawn from his connection to the Blight. Kieran's eyes narrowed. And father would do everything he could to avoid having to harm the son of two of his friends. He wants Duncan so he can make a run on the warden. Colin leaned back in his chair. His eyes were stone. And he intends to use my son as his host when he does so. I wish to set him on fire. Lenore folded her arms. There was something else. Gavrin sighed, and ran a hand through his hair. He shifted a little, and looked down. And Duncan looked at him. Gavrin met his eyes. He offered to take the two of us to a place of safety, giving us his personal protection. No. Duncan shook his head. Not a chance. He blinked. Mafarotha's balls, you're not actually considering it, are you? A chance to pull Fenharil out of this fight. Gavrin nodded. Yes, I'm considering it. As long as Fenharil is dealing with you and I, he's not here trying to get to the staff first. Duncan shook his head. But that pulls us out of the fight as well. And what if he decides to keep you? Alistair shook his head. Father and I would go retrieve them. Kieran shrugged. They are my friends. I can find them anywhere. That's. Alistair nodded. Good to know, actually. I'm not going anywhere with the Dread Wolf. Duncan narrowed his eyes. He turned towards the group. But this does give us more options. We know who Baradize wants and why, so dash. If a suggestion that we use the two of you as bait comes out of your mouth, I will personally drag you to that Eluvian and shove you in. Alistair's voice rang out sharply. It's not a bad dash, Gavrin started to say. Gavrin. Dorian. Rutherford. Colin stared at his son, cutting off whatever Gavrin had been going to suggest. Well, then. Kieran shrugged. I guess that means we will be using me. And what if he does kill you? Lenore turned towards him. Kieran got a pained expression on his face. Then I have to sit through another of my parents' lectures on being more careful. 4 hours. Oh, those are the worst. Gavrin gave him a sympathetic look. Is letting him go really such a good idea? Alistair glanced at Bruhan, and then back at Tissalin. Do you really want Fenharil showing up personally to retrieve him? Bruhan sighed, and went to the door of the room that contained the prisoner. It's not like we were getting anything useful out of him. How far in over our heads do you think we are at the moment? Remember the moment we realized Darkspawn had taken the Tower of Ishal? Bruhan sighed. Feels a lot like that. Bruhan. Yes. Remember. He shook his head. Duncan and Eamon and. He sighed. Remember when we used to think the Old Guard had the answers? And now we are the Old Guard. Bruhan nodded. Alistair turned to Tissalin. At what point do we actually get to know the answers? When I find out. Tissalin shrugged. I will tell you. Lenore blinked when Agatha seated herself in Jarotha's lap, and kissed the man. When exactly had that happened? How had that happened? To keep herself from commenting or giving looks of disapproval, she walked over to the stairs, where she found her cousin staring, his jaw hanging slightly open. She started to ask, and followed his gaze. Sala was laying on a pallet, snuggled tightly into Kieran. An old god, a former archdemon, had his arms wrapped around her niece as they both slept. I'm not imagining that, am I? Hawk glanced at her. My daughter is kissing a man who is both 13 and 30. Was it really too much to hope they'd be normal? Exactly. She leaned into him, and felt his arm go around her shoulders. If it was normal, it wouldn't be our family. Bruhan. Caleb waved at him from where he was sitting with Tissalin. He walked over to join them. Yes. So, I was going to ask Tissalin which of his sons he thinks you are descended from. He smiled at the elven man. Which would you guess? Nelorus died childless. My other sons were Halaven and Vinisal. Halaven had 2 daughters. Thus you are the descendant of Vinisal. Bruhan leaned back in his chair, and then shrugged. What was Vinisal like? A good man. Tissalin lifted a shoulder. Though I admit to bias. He was a woodworker, specializing in the craft of musical instruments. Tissalin looked down at his hands. He had 4 sons of his own. With luck, you are descended from his youngest, Tyrion. What do you say with luck? Caleb leaned forward. Was Tyrion special? He was the smart one. So a great scholar? No. Tissalin shook his head. He raised sheep, on a small farm. He stayed out of the war, out of the politics, away from the cities, away from causes and creeds, far from both adventure and hard questions. Ah. Burhan smiled. The smart one. Only one intelligent enough not to pick up a sword in the first place. Tissalin rubbed his thumb into the palm of his hand. Anara would have been amused by this. A piece of her uncle's, met across these long years. He took a deep breath. The universe has a very odd sense of humor. It does. Burhan leaned back in his chair. My father died before I was born. By the time the opportunity arose to meet any of his family, they were a decade in their graves. I didn't think there were any Mahariels left in the world. Mahariel. Tissalin smiled. Then you are likely not of Tyrion. He folded his hands, setting his arms on his knees as he leaned forward. Durlathan had only 2 children, both sons, the younger of whom he called Mahariel. Odd, what survives the years? Tell me of Mahariel. He and his brother both studied at the Sulanven. Mahariel was a gentle lad. He could sing, but his preference was the harp. I remember. Tissalin chuckled. I remember he had a great fear of Anara's wolf. The beast was convinced there was no food in the world tastier than that poor boy. Yeah. Burhan nodded. He'd be the one then. He shook his head. I have the scars to prove it. So we have a plan. Lenore looked around. Colin gave her a frustrated look. Yes. Not a good plan then. A good plan really wasn't one of the options. Agatha moved lightly across the rooftops. A moment later, Burhan landed beside her. Tissalin is in position. The white bridge, up by that reflective spire. Agatha nodded. Burhan turned in that direction, and narrowed his eyes. A sentinel. Definitely an elf, anyway, but it's not Melavan. She glanced back at him. How often do you run into other people when roof running? Far more often than you might think. He smiled. Once, in Dinarum, I ran into 8 people in one night. One of them was King Alistair's nephew. Remind me to tell you about the night I ended up in a turf war between 4 different thieves' guilds. He pointed. There is our signal. She saw the hawk, and nodded. I feel useless. Caleb sighed. Adralicus nodded. Why do they need 2 of us to guard one wounded man? I'm fairly confident you have who is guarding who. Confused. Loghain shook his head. Kells stood a couple paces from the commander, hand on his sword, ready to move at the signal. He could see Kieran, Dorian, and Arendaw talking in the foyer. The Colt had to know by now which properties Magister Arendaw owned by now. It had been decided that leaving Kieran unguarded was entirely too obvious, and so Hawke and Fenris were nearby, apparently engrossed in a board game. There was little left to do but wait. I hate waiting. Duncan sighed, and fingered his bow. I should have joined the folks on the roofs. No. He glared at Jarath. You remember the part where I'm the one who gives the orders? He sighed. I'd be better with a higher vantage point anyway. With all due respect. Jarath, why is it whenever you say, with all due respect, what I hear is kiss my arse? You are capable of understanding subtext. Agatha is a bad influence on you. His father chuckled. I couldn't have done what you did. Caleb didn't look at the man sitting next to the stairs. And I can't decide if that's a good thing or a bad thing. Caleb. Loghain started to shake his head. Shut up. Caleb took a deep breath. But I know if you hadn't done it, we'd all be dead or worse. Sala and Kieran wouldn't have arrived in time to help us, and as soon as the cult discovered the key missing they'd have done something to the others. So maybe it was a good thing, that you were there, and you could make that choice. He swallowed. I guess, in my own stupid way, I'm trying to tell you I'm sorry. Thank you. She opened her hand. Caleb nodded. Remember that part, okay? It wasn't all on you. She made her choice too. I know. Loghain sighed. Maybe in time, that will dash. His head came up sharply, and then he stood. Loghain. Get your crossbow, and get ready. Loghain drew his sword as Caleb grabbed the crossbow and ducked behind some barrels. Adralicus. The Magister grabbed his staff and stood, looking around. I don't hear any. Shrapnel flew through the room as part of the wall exploded. The call of the hawk pierced the air, and Agatha saw people moving towards the building. On the roof across from her she saw Melavin, waiting at the edge of the roof like a cat waiting to pounce. She tensed, waiting, dagger in each hand. Leandra saw the mage start to summon his magic. A heartbeat later, she felt a surge of energy from her father as he shut the spell down. Immediately, Gavarin was drawing on magic of his own and the group of enemy cultists were abruptly all pulled together into a tight grouping. A few of them managed to stab each other in the process. A shout went up. Kells heard the window shatter. He saw the astonished look on Dorian's face when Kieran caught the arrow just a few inches from the Magister's throat. More arrows struck a barrier. There was shouting from the alley, and then the commander was moving. Kells drew his own blade and followed. Sala switched forms as she landed next to Agatha, and immediately called up a barrier around Agatha and Bruhan. No sooner had she finished than Tessalin and Melavin had leapt from their hiding places and were upon the cultists attempting to sneak up on the building. Agatha and Bruhan landed a heartbeat later, putting their own weapons to good use. She remained where she was, calling up ice to aid the combatants. Loghain saw Adralicus call up a barrier, but the onslaught still took the mage off his feet. He barely got his own shield up in time to block the debris. Caleb got his own head down, dodging the shrapnel before coming back up and firing his crossbow into the oncoming trouble. The woman leading the attack was Elvin, and carried a coppery staff. Shit. Loghain saw her gathering the spell. With little other option, he called the Fade to him and dove into the fray. Colin got his shield between Dorian and a cultist just in time to block the blow from an axe. He felt the same curious energy he'd felt during the battle against the Cunnery, and realized belatedly that it must be Kieran's magic. Next to him, Kells had moved into a defensive position in front of Kieran. Hawk and Fenris were doing what they did best. Kirkwall's most famous battle couple were making short work of the cultists pouring in from the rear of the building. He gestured at Kells, and they began to push back against those coming in from the front, giving the mages space to work. To the left he saw fire raining down on the cultists, along with arrows. Alistair, Jarath, and Trian were in the thick of things. On the right, the elves backed by Sala were sowing chaos. He saw Leandra pull her father to the side, and had a moment to wonder where his son was before most of a city block suddenly picked itself up and flung a group of cultists into the air, screaming. Gavarin strode through the wreckage, green flames trailing up around him as he flung spells. Leandra gave a triumphant laugh before diving back in, using a roundhouse kick to send a man twice her size flying hard enough to go through before putting her giant blade to work. For a single horrified moment he couldn't help but wonder just what his grandkids were going to be like. Duncan was taking aim when his eyes fell on one of the mages. Fire raced through his veins as he adjusted his aim. The blood mage started moving just as he fired, and the arrow missed him by half an inch. Immediately, the man started running back the other way. Duncan leaped from the balcony and followed. Chapter 40. Out of the corner of his eye, Jarath saw Duncan moving. He glanced back at the fight. Alistair and Trian pushed forward, fighting back to back as if they had done it for years. He snarled, and then turned to go chasing after his idiot of a king. Well, that went well. Hawk smiled. Kieran frowned. No. He shook his head. This is wrong. We won. Trian shook his head. What's wrong with that? Sala nodded. He's right. No Barad. No Siofra. No Padar. Alistair suddenly growled. No Duncan or Jarath. They went that dash. Kieran's head came up sharply. Loghain and Caleb are under attack. Carver, Hawk, Fenris, get back to the warehouse. Colin barked the order and saw all three men immediately start running. Kiran, which way are? Green energy flowed from Kiran as he raised his hands. Lightning hit the barrier less than a heartbeat later, striking with enough force that the energy reflected back into nearby buildings, sending stone and stray magic flying. At the edges of the barrier, Leandra, Dorian, and Melavan were knocked off their feet. Kiran fell to one knee as the barrier faded. Sala rushed to the wounded. Leandra. Magic wreathed itself around Gavrin as he turned in the direction of the attack. His feet left the ground as the energy of the fade flowed around him. The massive stone bridge the enemy mages were standing on suddenly ripped free of the building to which it was attached. It went hurtling through the night sky as some unseen force flung it away. The spell slid off him as he slashed the blade through the first attacker. He saw Siofra's eyes widen slightly. Caleb popped up from behind his cover and sent a crossbow bolt into the face of the other mage. A warrior got his shield up in time to block Loghain's blow. Loghain spun away, then used his own shield to push back. The warrior staggered backwards, and Loghain sent his next blow low, taking the man's leg off at the knee, sending his enemy to the ground screaming. A blade opened a gash in his shoulder, and he used the edge of his shield to return the favor before running the man through. Caleb's bolt bounced off Siofra's barrier as she ducked behind the remaining warriors, putting them between herself and Loghain. The staff glowed with power as she summoned her magic, crackling with lightning. An Adralicus hit her with a tackle, knocking the staff out of her hand as both mages fell over the railing. The mage was full on running. Duncan was only vaguely aware that a few other cultists had escaped the fray. If they saw him, they clearly decided to let him be. He growled with frustration as the city's architecture again prevented him from getting a clear shot of the moving man. His mother's killer headed towards one of the towers, vanishing inside. Duncan hurried after him. Sala saw Melavan's eyes stare openly up at the sky. There was nothing to be done for the man. She moved to Leandra's side, hands glowing white. Leandra's chest still rose and fell, though her breath rattled. Magi stir pavis. Arenda's voice shook as she knelt next to Dorian. Dorian. The woman's hands trembled as she tried the healing spell. I'm sorry. Kiran said as Alistair helped him back to his feet. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. The magic faded from Gavrin as his feet touched the ground once more. Wordlessly, he went to Leandra, kneeling on the opposite side. Is she? She lives. Sala nodded. Melavan. She turned to Arenda. Dorian. Arenda covered her mouth with one hand as she shook her head. Maker, no. Colin went to Dorian's side. He knelt, and bowed his head. No. She saw Desalin do the same for Melavan, gently closing the man's eyes. Mythalin asked, Lethalin. Jaroth saw Duncan leap, grabbing the edge of a balcony and pulling himself up before entering one of the towers. He shook his head in frustration. He'd never managed that in full armor, even with Kiran's spell serving to bolster him. Without breaking stride, he went for the stairs. A man in servant's robes held up a hand. Excuse me, you can't. I have a sword. Jaroth fixed him with steely eyes. You don't. I am in a hurry. Be elsewhere. The man swallowed and got out of his way. Caleb saw the staff hit the ground. He dove out of cover and scooped it up before the enemy warriors could react. From the warehouse floor below, he heard an agonized scream from Adralicus before it abruptly cut off. Loghain. Run. Loghain replied, hamstringing a warrior that had turned towards Caleb. The safe house, go. He ran, clutching the staff to him. Kells helped Colin carry Dorian's body back into the house. They laid him on a table. Desalin and Bruhan entered a moment later, carrying Melavan, and laid the elf down next to him. Outside, Sala still knelt next to Leandra, eyes closed in concentration as she worked her magic. Kiran knelt next to her, his own hands glowing as he amplified her magic. Gavrin was pacing back and forth as he watched them. Lenore moved through, healing the minor wounds taken by the others. She touched Kells, fading the minor bruises he'd taken during the fight, before turning to Colin. Colin. He nodded, and she stepped forward to work the healing magic. Thank you. Colin sighed as he looked back at the two bodies laying silently. Maker. He looked towards where his son was pacing. Leandra. Before Lenore could reply, there was a gasping sound from where Leandra lay, and the young woman opened her eyes. Gavarin immediately rushed forward, pulling her into his arms and holding her close. Sala started to rise, and staggered. Kieran swung her up into his arms and carried her into the house, ignoring her weak protest of the action. Gavarin kissed Leandra, and then picked her up and followed. Kells saw the look on Alistair's face, and turned towards Kieran. Kieran, you said you know where Duncan is. He hunts. Jaroth hunts him. Kieran set Sala down gently before looking up at Kells. I can't focus. It's broken and bleeding, pain leaking across the echoes, drowning out the other tunes. He stood, looking at the table. I wasn't strong enough. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Alistair walked forward and put his arms around the young man, holding him gently. Kieran, at his best, even your father couldn't save everyone. None of us blame you. Duncan waited patiently for his quarry to appear. It didn't take long. The mage came around the corner, and his eyes widened. What the dash? The arrow took him between the eyes. Blood trickled from the wound, and he crumpled into a heap. That was for my mother. He slung his bow onto his back, and started back to the others. Gavarin caressed Leandra's face as she looked around her in confusion. What happened? She asked, blinking up at him. The mages tried for a decisive strike. Kieran blocked most of it, but... He looked at the table, hardly able to believe his eyes. Dorian and Melavin are dead. She sat up, putting her arms around him. He held her close, and felt himself shaking. I almost lost you. He felt his father's hand on his shoulder, gentle and comforting. Guilt filled him as he realized just how much worry he'd put his father through in the past few weeks. And it wasn't over yet. He looked up. They sprang our trap with one of their own. He stood. Kieran. Kieran looked up at him. Yes. Gavarin stared at Dorian's body. At where the best of Tevinter lay, broken and lost. His eyes flicked to Melavin, a man that had been dragged into one war too many across the centuries. A curious calm filled him. We kill Baradies, none of this ever happens. Yes. Then we've got a long night ahead of us. He bent, and picked up his staff. A fierce smile came to Kieran's face as he stood. He clenched his fists, and there was a flash of energy. Gavarin felt as if he'd just had several days of rest. Kieran nodded. I believe you are correct. Are you too insane? Arendaw stood. Simple as that, you're off to kill a demon like that's something easy. If it were easy. Kieran held out his hand, and his staff flew into it from across the room. His eyes began to glow. Someone else would do it. He was really starting to hate Tevinter architecture. After a couple thousand years, the building had been repurposed so many times the layouts made no sense whatsoever. Jaroth caught a glimpse of movement, and headed in that direction. Regicide might be taking matters a little bit far, but a certain king was in desperate need of an ass-kicking. Sala rose as though she hadn't just a few minutes ago worked magic that would have driven half a dozen mages into exhaustion. Lenore couldn't help but feel just slightly impressed. The girl picked up the green staff, which glowed faintly in response to her touch. A moment later, Lenore's mouth dropped open as Leandra stood up just as smoothly and moved to Gavarin's side. There is a demon that really needs to learn who he's fucking with. And what exactly are the lot of you intending to do? Lenore folded her arms. I think the general idea is to splatter the formless one across the veil. Gavarin nodded to her. They are going to try to cut off our refuges. Kieran tilted his head. They will think we are more vulnerable on the move. Is that why they struck at the warehouse? Kells asked. It was vulnerable, and contained potential hostages. Kieran smiled. I do not think it worked out well for them, being that Loghain and Caleb are on the move again. They are being chased, and will need our assistance. My boys are still out there. Alistair shook his head. Kieran tilted his head, and then nodded. They are at the tower with the silver spire. Duncan is very pleased with himself. I'm going to change that. Alistair folded his arms. Rapidly, he turned towards Bruhan. I'm going after them. I'll come with you. Bruhan nodded. Me too. Lenore rose. Arendelle glanced again at the bodies on the table. I'll remain here. This position is vulnerable. Cullen sighed, and nodded to Alistair. I'll stay with Arendelle until Hawke returns. He glanced at Kells. Keep an eye on my idiot son, please. Kells closed a fist over his heart. Yes, sir. Time is rusting. Tryan gestured at the door. Lenore saw Desalin move into a bodyguard position behind Sala as the girl, woman, led her small army out into the world. She glanced at Alistair. Well, let's go save your boy from his bodyguard. Maker's breath. Hawke said as they approached the warehouse. Carver stared. Part of the wall was missing, and he could see flames flickering within. Shit. He started running again, Fenris and Hawke at his heels. Bodies littered the top of the stairs, but he saw no signs of his nephew or Loghain. Caleb. Hawke called, his voice sounding frantic. Fenris started moving through the rooms. Caleb. Loghain. Carver headed back down the stairs, and caught a whiff of an unpleasantly familiar smell. He turned, and then rushed to the corpse. The left side of Adralicus's body was burned meat and char. You poor bastard. Caleb. He heard his brother's voice. Carver, do you see him? I found Adralicus. He walked back to the stairs and looked up at his brother's panic-stricken face. He's dead. There's no sign of Caleb or Loghain. There are 2 more bodies near the other exit. Fenris joined Hawke. Both dead to a sword blade. There are no signs anyone was dragged from the building. He put a hand on Hawke's shoulder. Hawke wrapped his arms around his husband, and the two stood locked in a worried embrace. They made it out. Maker keep them safe. We'll never find them without Kieran. Carver picked up a blanket, and went to wrap Adralicus's body. We need to head back. Duncan walked through the door to see 3 elven men in sentinel armor. He shook his head. You guys really can't take a hint, can you? One stepped forward. I am Abelas. You will come with us. Magic glowed around the man's hands. It would be best if you did not make us hurt you. He reached for his bow, and Abelas waved a hand. The magic jerked him off his feet, and his bow went skittering across the marble floor. Abelas started walking towards him when another voice rang through the corridor. Let's get one thing straight. Jarath came around the corner, sword and shield at the ready. The only person that gets to hurt him is me. The nearest sentinel turned towards him, and Jarath flung his sword. It caught the elven man in the chest, sending him to the ground. Jarath charged, grabbing the hilt of his sword as he did so and slamming his shield into the next sentinel, sending the man flying backwards. Abelas threw a spell, and Jarath rolled to dodge it, coming up to run his blade through the staggered sentinel's midsection. He pulled it free and spun to remove the elven man's head from his shoulders. Abelas drew a blade of his own just in time to parry Jarath's swing. Duncan rolled towards his bow. He came up with an arrow notched just in time to see Jarath pull his sword free of Abelas's chest. The sentinel collapsed. Duncan got all the way back to his feet and let out a low whistle. I don't pay you enough. You ran off without me. Jarath sheathed his sword and started for Duncan, fists clenched. Before you kick my ass. Duncan held up his hands. I got him. Got him. The blood mage. Duncan smiled. Put an arrow between his eyes. As pleased as I am to hear that. Jarath shook his head. As soon as I get you to a safe location I am going to beat the ever-loving shit out of you. He shook his head. Let's get out of here. You do recall the part where beating up your king is treason, right? Duncan started for the exit as Jarath fell into step behind him. Caleb stopped in his tracks when he saw the sentinel step out of the shadows to block his path. The man drew his blade and took a step towards Caleb. You have something we need. He took a step backwards, and then Loghain was there. The knight's shield hit the sentinel with enough force to send him staggering backward. The sentinel parried the sword blow, and hurled ice with his free hand. For a moment, it looked as if he could see through Loghain, and the spell slid away harmlessly. The knight's blade tore the sentinel's head from his shoulders a moment later. Are you? Caleb stared at Loghain in shock. The other man's eyes were glowing. Loghain, you. Loghain shrugged as the glow faded. Like father like son, as the saying goes. He looked down at the corpse. If they were waiting here, then they know about the safe house. He half closed his eyes, and a moment later a wisp started to glow in front of him. Take us to Sala. The wisp glowed brighter for a moment before it started to lead them westward. Colin rose when he saw Hawk. He felt his blood go cold when he saw the bundled form Carver was carrying. Oh, Maker no. Adralicus. Carver looked down at his burden. Carver trailed off when he saw the bodies laid on the table. What happened? Right after you left, there was another attack. Colin shook his head. Mages on the heights. Kieran senses it, got a barrier up, but Dorian, Melavin, and Leandra were too close to its edge. Leandra. Carver's eyes widened, and there was panic in his voice. She's all right. Sala and Kieran managed to heal her, but it was too late for the others. Alistair has gone to retrieve Duncan and Jarath, and the others are looking for Loghain and Caleb. Carver carried Adralicus's body to Arendar. Her face was tired when she gestured for him to lay it next to Dorian's. She shook her head. He wasn't much more than a kid himself. Tears started to fall from her eyes. What's the plan now? Hawk raised an eyebrow at Colin. Now. Colin sighed. He spread his hands. I once saw you throw a rock the same size as yourself half a city block. I remember thinking it was pretty impressive. Colin met Hawk's eyes. That was before I saw my son rip apart a building and fling it a few miles. He is impressive. They all turned at the sound of the new voice. Colin hesitated, and then nodded. Salas. The elven man walked towards the table, and looked down at where Dorian lay. He touched the man's head gently before shaking his head and sighing. A light has gone out in the world. He looked down at Melavin. I would take Melavin to lay with his niece, and the rest of his family. Colin nodded. I'm sure he would appreciate that. Salas turned to look behind him, and two men entered. They picked up the body, and left again as quietly as they had come. Salas stood there silently for a time before looking again at Dorian's body. Iron Bull is not going to take this well. He nodded. Please convey my sympathy to him and the Inquisitor. Thank you, Salas. Colin nodded to him. He stood there a moment longer before turning and vanishing into the night. He stepped through the archway and found himself on landing overlooking a small garden. I would have sworn Jarath shoved him off the landing. He landed sprawled on the ground below. What the hell, he turned and stared up in horror. A man stood on the ledge with Jarath. Esoteric white tattoos decorated the man's skin, glowing with an eerie pale light. And his hand was buried in Jarath's chest. He twisted his wrist slightly, and Jarath responded with a ragged cry of pain. The man smiled. Your friend here has a strong heart. He looked down at Duncan. I can feel it beating in my hand. Don't. Duncan shook his head frantically. Don't. Please. He reached for his bow, only to stop as the man moved his hand again. Please. Please. The man's lips curled back, showing his teeth. Are you begging? For this life. Just let him go. Please. Duncan stood, and held his hands out to his side. The man looked back at Jarath. Blood trickled from the corner of Jarath's mouth as he gasped for breath. He turned his eyes back to Duncan. I believe we can come to a suitable arrangement, Your Majesty. Jarath coughed weakly, and his hand closed around the other man's wrist. He took a ragged breath. Run. Time stood still. The edges of his vision blurred. And then he kept his promise. Hating himself with every step, he ran. Chapter 41. Kieran's head came up sharply. Kieran. Sala turned towards him. Your brother and Loghain are that way. He pointed. I need to go to Duncan. He kissed her. I will find you. Be careful. She nodded. He turned into a hawk and flew east. She gestured to the others and they continued the way he had pointed. Caleb kept close to Loghain as they moved through the alleys, twisting and winding through the city. Hundreds of questions ran through his mind, and he kept his mouth shut. His knuckles were white on the staff as he held it to him. There was no doubt in his mind Adralicus was dead. The man's scream still rang in his ears. He'd saved them. Guilt racked him as he thought of how they'd treated the man back in Nessum. A hero in the end, when it mattered. Two now. Adralicus and a lie. Two people who'd died so he could live. If he ever made it back to Kirkwall, he was never going to go adventuring again. Tears blinded him as he ran. He stumbled, nearly tripping on an uneven part of the street. He caught himself on a wall, and then punched it viciously. Fuck. Duncan yanked the bow off his shoulder and turned to go back the way he had come, praying it wasn't too late. Black wings flew past his head, and then Kieran stood there, blocking his path. Duncan. Jarath needs our help. We've got to. Kieran caught him by the shoulders, stopping his forward momentum. Duncan. Duncan choked on his breath. He looked up at Kieran. His music has ended. No. Duncan shook his head. No. He can't. A ragged sob escaped him. Oh fuck. He jerked backwards and started slamming his fists into the stone wall. I got him killed. I didn't think. I ran off, and his knuckles tore, leaving blood on the wall. I got him killed. I didn't listen and I got him killed. Gently, Kieran pulled him away from the wall, and put his arms around him. Duncan clung to the other man as if he was drowning. He buried his face in Kieran's chest and wept like a child. Brehon came out of the doorway and saw Lenore talking to a man in servant's robes. Are we sure we are in the right building? She indicated the man. Says he was threatened by a man who matches Jarath's description. She gestured to the man to go about his business, and started down the corridor. Perhaps they are already dash. Lenore. Terror filled Alistair's voice. Immediately they started running towards the sound. They found Alistair kneeling next to the still form of a red-haired man. Oh, Maker, no. Lenore flung herself down next to him, hands glowing white. No, no, no. Brehon walked forward. Jarath's eyes were open, staring sightlessly up at the night sky. Blood glistened from where he'd bitten through his lip, and the front of his armor was stained with red. Jarath. Alistair touched the young man's cheek. Jarath. I'm sorry, Alistair. Brehon put his hand on Alistair's shoulder. He looked around at the garden, but saw no sign of Duncan. There was also no sign of further struggle. There is no way Duncan would have been taken quietly, not with his oldest friend laying dead on the cold stone. I was there. The first time he saw the sky. Cathiel sat with Nigera, and Rory brought him out to the balcony. He was. Alistair swallowed. I gave him his first sword. Cathiel and I didn't think we'd ever have children, and tears rolled down his cheeks. He knelt, putting an arm around Alistair's shoulders. I'm so sorry. I woke one evening, after we got back from Red Cliff. Went to the nursery, just to check. Duncan's crib was gone. I started to. He swallowed again. Panic, and then I saw it. Jarath had moved it to over behind his bed. I came over and he brushed the red hair back from the dead man's face. Asked him why he'd moved it. And this brave little boy clutched the little toy sword I'd given him and looked up at me with huge eyes and said. Alistair's shoulders shook. So the monsters have to come through me first. He brushed a hand over the face, shutting Jarath's eyes. They killed one of my boys. I need. He let out a ragged breath. I have to find Duncan. We will. Lenore put her hand on Alistair's arm. Sala lead them to yet another flight of stairs. This city is actually more confusing than Kirkwall. There. From beside her, Tissalin pointed, and she saw a glimpse of movement below. Two familiar-shaped figures were running into an alley, and a moment later armed figures moved into the alley after him. Tissalin, get down there and help them. We'll come around and back you up. She gestured, using her magic to put a barrier around the elven man. He leaped down, bouncing from ledge to ledge before hitting the ground at a dead run and moving after the vanishing figures. She turned and gestured for Gavrin to head down one flight of stairs while she took the other half of the group down the other. Anyone after her brother was going to be caught in the middle. Loghain gritted his teeth in frustration. For the love of... He shook his head. How many of you am I going to have to kill? The leader of the group took a step towards him. Where are the rest of you? He spoke with an Antivan accent. Next to him, Caleb's mouth opened. Crows? Seriously? One day, I am going to learn not to walk through a town with animals. Loghain winced. Two of the men aimed bows at them. The one who'd spoken earlier showed his teeth. Throw down your weapons, and we will show mercy. A foot of glowing blade suddenly protruded from the chest of the first archer. A heartbeat later, a second blade removed the head of the second. If the gods intended mercy. Tissalan stepped into their midst, hands glowing where he held the magic swords. They would not have sent me. I am going to steal that line. Loghain hefted his shield and charged. Leandra brought her blade down on the man who'd just ordered her to surrender, bisecting him vertically. She looked at the four men that had been behind him. Allow us to make a counter-offer. Next to her, green fire lit around Gavrin. Leandra smiled. Run. She'd barely finished getting the word out when they did exactly that. Agatha rolled her eyes. Seriously, that's what passes for crows these days. Kells stared at the man as though he were speaking a completely incomprehensible language. Are you saying you are surrendering to us? Traian shook his head. No, I think he actually expects us to surrender. There are 5 of them. Kells looked down at the dwarf. 5. There was a team of 3 once that though they were going to take on my fathers. Sala shrugged. The crows started looking at each other in confusion. The one in the lead shook his head. I will be honest. This is not the reaction we usually get. You do know who we are, yes? Well, actually. The man frowned. Other than descriptions of your appearances and a couple first names. He shook his head. No. Sala Hawk. Traian Sedida. Kells Marland. Our friends over there are Loghain MacTier, Caleb Hawk, Gavrin Rutherford, Leandra Hawk, and Agatha Amel. Sala gestured at where the sounds of combat could be heard. Jaroth Gilmore, Duncan Thurin, and Kieran Tabri are on their way and will be here any moment. Ah. The man paled, and then gave her a small bow. We apologize for disturbing you. Please have a pleasant evening. The rest of the men also bowed before following him out of the area. Sala shrugged, and headed into the alley. Caleb looked to his left to see Leandra leading Gavrin and Agatha towards them. A glance to his right showed Sala followed by Traian and Kells. You might want to rethink this. He looked at the men who had just stepped out of the nearby building, and gestured at the men Loghain and Tissalan had cut down like weeds. It doesn't look like this night is going well for you guys. Ferelden dogs. I'm going to dash. Tissalan kicked the severed head of the man he'd killed earlier. It hit the speaker in the face, sending him staggering backwards and shattering his nose. One of the other men took another look at the alley, grabbed the speaker, and hauled him back into the building. The rest of the men followed, shutting the door behind them. He turned towards Tissalan. Can you be my grandfather too? It really wouldn't come as much of a surprise. Tissalan shrugged. Caleb. Sala took a step towards him, her eyes wide. That's. Slowly, he lifted the staff up. Adralicus. He got it away from her, and she killed him for it. Shit. Leandra shook her head. Now I feel really bad about the rabbit ear thing. Where is Kieran? Loghain looked around. He went to get Duncan and Jaroth. Sala waved a hand. Let's get out of the open. He'll find us. Alistair stared down at the crystal in his hand. Burhan started to offer, and he shook his head. The boys had been his responsibility. He looked towards where Jarotha's wrapped body lay next to the still forms of Adralicus and Dorian. Then he turned his eyes to Fenris. When you He swallowed. I mean, your ability. He hung his head before looking back up at Fenris. Did he suffer? No. Fenris shook his head. Maker, I wish you were a better liar. He stood, and took the crystal into the next room. Nijera fell to her knees, shoulders shaking. Cathiel knelt next to her, putting her arms around the other woman as tears of her own began to fall. Rory sank into a chair, his eyes staring off into the distance as he shook his head in disbelief. Chief. Iron Bull took a deep breath, and then put his fist through the wall. Agatha looked up when she saw Kieran walking towards them, followed by Duncan. She looked for Jarath, and then frowned. Her eyes went to Duncan's face, and she felt her heart lurch. She took a halting step forward. Jarath. Duncan turned away, clenching his fists. She closed her eyes. Sala put a hand on her shoulder and pulled her in close as she started to cry. Hesitantly, Caleb handed the staff to Kieran. Kieran looked down at it, frowning slightly as he did so. He tilted his head, and closed his eyes. Gavrin glanced at Sala before looking back at Kieran. So. It was raining. Drops beating a pattern on a stone roof. They piled what they had. Armbands. Knives. A flute. Harp strings. Sand through the hourglass, knowing what was to come. Our last working, secret and sacred, and they were gone. A tear rolled down his cheek. And then so was I. You remember? Sala laid her hand on his arm. I remember. He opened his eyes again. So. Caleb glanced around. Is it a key, or? It is not a key. Kieran shook his head. Green fire lit his eyes, and magical energy suddenly crisscrossed his entire body. Earthamul's voice reverberated through the room. It is a door. A door. Sala blinked. Slowly, he put his hand into the loop on the top of the staff. It vanished from view rather than coming out of the other side. Earthamul smiled, and pulled his hand back out, holding an item. Maker's breath. Kells breathed the words. Stone. Tryan echoed him. Sala stared as the orb in the old god's hand began to glow. All right. She nodded. So, we need to kill Barad-dûs. And keep that thing the hell away from Salas. She looked around. Ideas? Earthamul smiled. Yes. Chapter 42. Gavrin put his arm around Leandra as they listened to Desalin sing. It wasn't the same song Bruhan had sung at Rainier's funeral, or on any of the other occasions the Inquisition had mourned its own. The Dalish eulogy was of letting sorrow go and moving on, a song of grief and healing. The song Desalin sang was of facing death on one's own terms, fighting side by side to the very last, accepting the end without fear, with the only hope remaining being that they would be remembered. Not a eulogy, but a warrior's dirge. Tonight, a far more fitting tune. Any sign of them? Alistair paced. They should have been back by now. At any point did they actually say they were coming back? Bruhan raised an eyebrow. No. Alistair sighed. No, they did not. He picked up his shield. I'm going after them. Hawk and Fenris both stood. We can split up, cover more ground. Arendaw gestured at the guards that had gathered. Some of my people should stay here, but the rest can accompany you. We'll find them, drag them back here, and sit on them until reinforcements arrive. Lenore grabbed her staff. She shoved her finger into Carver's chest. And then you are contacting your wife so we can shove them through her Eluvian and back to Kirkwall. Where my wife and guard Captain Avellini can sit on them. Cullen strapped his own shield to his arm. I don't recall confining them working out all that well for Sebastian. Carver stood, and then his eyes went to the bodies on the table. If nothing else, they could likely use backup. Sala moved to stand next to the glowing being as he looked out over the city. What is it you hear now? 1,000 melodies racing to the sunrise, only to begin anew. Earthamul shook his head. The song did not end. It simply changed. He folded his arms. Thank you. For what? She raised an eyebrow. Being. I don't dash. He caught her arm and pulled her to him before kissing her. It felt like Kieran's kiss, and yet there's something else. She felt lightning race through her bones, bordering for a heartbeat on the cusp of pain before he released her. A very old song. And by far the greatest. Earthamil smiled, and turned back into the building. She touched her lips, and then followed. Cullen took 2 of the guards, and headed in the direction he'd last seen the children go. After a bit of hesitation, Aranda accompanied him. Alistair and 2 others of the guard headed back towards the last known location of Duncan. Brian headed back up to the rooftops with the one guard that thought she stood a chance of keeping up. Carver and Lenore headed towards the safe house. Hawk and Fenris went to see if they could pick up the trail from the warehouse. What's going through your head right now? Kells glanced over at Loghain, and turned back to watch the others make their preparations. Leandra refastened her vambrace, then helped Caleb adjust his armor. Tryan strapped a shield to his arm. Duncan added a second quiver to what he was carrying. Skyhold when the breach reopened, knowing that Darkspawn were on their way and we didn't have enough forces to hold. He folded his arms. The Red Templars bearing down on Haven, with an archdemon in the sky. He shook his head. Demons falling out of rifts while we tried to open a path to get the Herald to that first breach. Standing with the Templars when Meredith went insane and turned the gallows into a charnel house. He leaned back. Running after Evelina, dragging 2 other kids with me as we tried to stay ahead of the Blight. You've had an interesting life. Loghain put a hand on his shoulder. I'm just wondering how many last stands one man gets in his life. He glanced at Tissalan. How many are you up to? Tissalan frowned thoughtfully before answering. 142. You've tried to get yourself killed 142 times. Kells raised an eyebrow at him. Yes. Tissalan adjusted his gauntlet, and shrugged. Turns out I am sort of bad at it. Well, Grandpa, you know what they say. Loghain put his helmet on. The 143rd time is the charm. He started to ask something else, and heard Sala's voice ring out. We all know what we have to do. She looked around. And I think we are ready. A determined smile came to her face. We know our timetable. The music is playing. She unlimbered her staff. Let's dance. They strode out into the night. Alistair moved through the building, looking for any sign of his son. One of the guards found signs of a fight. Blood on the ground, looking as though it had come from 3 different sources. And a single arrow by the wall. Tracks. 2 sets, from what little I can see. The guard pointed. Someone stepped in blood and walked off that way. And then someone else took the bodies off that way. He gestured in another direction. He frowned. The ones that took the bodies, at least one of those was barefoot, Your Majesty. The running tracks led towards where he had found Jarotha's body. He looked down at the smears of blood on the stone. A fight, and then his boys had walked away to where one of them died. Had Jarotha even seen the attack coming? There was nothing else to be found there. And he wasn't sure he could bear to step into that garden again. He waved at the second set of tracks, and the men with him started in that direction. Now and then he saw servants. Slaves. They barely looked up enough to acknowledge him, but he watched them with a wary eye anyway. The trail led them into a courtyard. One of the guards turned towards him to say something, and cut off with an agonizing cry as a glowing hand suddenly came through his chest. The second guard went for his sword as the tattooed man turned on him. He drew his own blade as the Lyrium warrior's sword took the guard's hand off at the wrist. The gauntleted hand sank into the guard's chest, and the Lyrium warrior smiled at Alistair. Hello, Your Majesty. You. Alistair's eyes settled on the blade the man held, and he felt a chill of recognition. He'd given that sword to Warden Commander Jarotha when awarding him the title of Arl. And the last time he'd seen it, it had been in the hands of his namesake. You killed Jarotha. Was that his name? The man raised an eyebrow. He smirked. It really wasn't my intention, but your coward of a son decided to save his own skin. Ran like a mouse. Even when I did this. He twisted his hand, and the guard screamed. Fury filled him. You son of a bitch. The Lyrium warrior twisted his hand again, and the guard cried out. Then he ripped his hand free with a sickening tearing sound. The guard fell to the ground and convulsed once before going still. He begged for mercy before I crushed his heart. Your son kind of annoyed me, scampering like that, abandoning his friend. The man's smile was cruel. So I took my time. He raised the blade as he started towards Alistair. Perhaps he will care a little more when it's your heart I hold in my hand. Several large figures moved out of the darkness. Bass. Cullen drew his sword, as did the guards with him. The Cunary were accompanied by a mixed group of humans and elves. Vidathari, likely their agents in the city. The Cunary men held spears, but the humans and elves held bows. The guards shifted nervously when they realized the bows were pointed at them. One of the Cunary wore different markings than the other. Surrender, Bass. He felt a stab of irritation. For what purpose? He hefted his shield. You are the father of the Sarbis. He must be contained. A laugh escaped him. If he could be contained, I wouldn't be out here at this time of night. Lay down your weapons, and you will be taken to the Vidathlok. The man hefted a spear. Anan Isam Kun. Let me see if I recall the correct response. Cullen took a deep breath. Mashev defranstim, Vinakhal. The Cunary started hefting their weapons. Arendar gave him a wide-eyed look. Did you just say what I think you said? Vinak Kothas. The Cunary in the lead started to hurl his spear, only to suddenly freeze into a statue of white stone. Ibasit Kata. Ibadim Mirazisalato. Salas stepped out of the shadows. Two of the Cunary turned towards him, and his eyes flashed briefly. Two more horned statues decorated the street. The rest of the Cunary turned and fled. The two guards with Cullen looked like they wanted to do the same. Salas. Commander. Salas gave him a disapproving look. You and your son are forcing my hand. He shook his head. Perhaps he will be more inclined to seek sanctuary if he must go there to recover you. Burhan moved across the roof, slowing his pace just slightly so the guard could keep up. Few stirred at all in the streets below. None of them looked to be the kids. He leaped to the next ledge, then caught the edge of the roof and pulled himself up. The guard faltered slightly, and he pulled her up by the wrist. They continued, spiraling in towards the center of the city. He looked up, and considered moving to the bridges that spanned between the towers. Except for where two of the towers sported damage where a bridge had been ripped away. To think, he'd once found Lenor's abilities terrifying. Together, they headed through what appeared to be a factory district. He could hear grinding from the foundry below. He was considering which building to move to next when the tiles beneath his feet exploded. They slid, both desperately seeking purchase amid the sharp and jagged pieces of broken tile. Landing hurt. He felt something in his leg snap, and was unsuccessful in biting back the cry. The guard struck her head on the edge of a table, and stopped moving. Footsteps rang on the stone as something moved towards him. Well well. He looked up to see a man in magister's robes, holding a staff. Magister Valis, if he was not mistaken, accompanied by a dozen others. The White Divine's pet elf, if I'm not mistaken. He tried to get to his feet, but the attempt to move sent a wave of pain that nearly made him black out. A glance down revealed the bone was actually sticking out of his leg. Finethis. Collect him. The Magister waved at the men accompanying him, and three of them started forward. And search him thoroughly. He's the one they call the Raven. Gabriel paced the landing of the warehouse before running a hand through his hair. Of all the family, I thought Caleb had the closest thing to a self-preservation instinct. He flung a handful of magic at the remains of a bottle, shattering it. Fenris stepped to him and caught him by the back of the neck. They will be fine. He leaned down slightly and kissed his husband, drawing what comfort he could. Alistair was right. I wish you were a better liar. Kieran said he could find the others, and they all certainly seemed to agree. Fenris let him go reluctantly. Which means wherever they are likely all together. I'm not sure that makes me feel better or dash. He felt a tingling on the edge of his senses, and suddenly what little magic he was still holding vanished from him. Templars. Well, well. A tall man with glowing eyes entered the room, accompanied by a dozen armored men. If it isn't the champion of Kirkwall, and his pet dog. Barad eyes. Fenris drew his blade. You killed my favorite sister. Barad eyes showed his teeth, lips curled back slightly. Given our respective histories, I'm sure you understand what I mean when I say this is a little bit. Fire appeared around his hands. Personal. So personal you brought a dozen Templars to the party. Gabriel drew his staff, preparing to provide Fenris with what backup he could. Oh, they aren't Templars. Barad eyes laughed. We simply do not. He waved a hand casually. Desire your magic to be a factor. He gestured at the men. I want him to watch the elf die. The men started forward, and Gabriel felt a chill as he saw their eyes begin to glow. Lenore felt the tingling of magical energy and gestured a warning to Carver. He immediately drew his sword. She called her magic to her. Dragon sworn. They looked up to the balcony above and saw an elven woman. Lenore narrowed her eyes. Siofra. And the Lady Braska. Siofra smiled. This is somewhat bittersweet for me, I admit. She nodded to Lenore. You are something of an inspiration. Almost a personal hero of mine. The first mage to not only gain her freedom, but to actually fight back to gain that freedom for others. She shook her head. Under any other circumstances, I'd be trying to convince you to join us. Oh, go ahead. Lenore smiled. I have a perverse fondness for the crazy cult recruitment speeches. I might even be able to give you a few pointers. I would love to oblige, but I fear I would just be wasting both of our times. Siofra sighed. You see, I'm about to rip out your cousin's soul, and I just don't think you are going to take that well. He blocked the blow with Starfang. The Lyrium warrior grinned. Nice sword. He spun away, dodging the blow from Alistair's shield. I look forward to adding it to my collection. Alistair lunged, aiming a low sweep at the man's leg. The man leaped his blade, and then brought his own down on Alistair's shield arm, slicing both strap and flesh. Alistair jerked backward before the Lyrium warrior could capitalize on his advantage. The only place it's going is through your guts. It's clear your son really wasn't suited for the role we planned for him anyway. The Lyrium warrior came in with an overhand blow that Alistair parried. We do have standards, after all. He smiled as he sent another blow at Alistair. Fortunately, you do have other children. Perhaps your daughter will be more suited. He roared as he lashed out with his shield again. The Lyrium warrior met it with his blade, knocking it free of his arm. Alistair rolled to dodge the next blow. He came up holding his broken arm to his chest. The shield slid across the ground. A foot stopped its motion. Really not a good idea to threaten my wife. Logain MacTier drew his blade. For the first time in many years, Cullen found himself wishing for a vial of lyrium. Not that he expected it to do a lot of good against the likes of Salas. Really? Another voice said, and they turned to see Desalin leaning on a nearby wall. The old, I have your father, play. He shook his head. How disappointing. What next? Indulging in diabolical laughter. Salas slowly turned. Desalin. You would think given the sheer number of years I have spent ignoring you that you would have the common courtesy to go away. Desalin raised an eyebrow. Name one person who would call me courteous. A chuckle escaped Salas. I know what you told Bahalin. It is not too late to reconsider. There are many who could learn from the wisdom of the last Minen. Name one person who would call me wise. Desalin straightened, and took a couple steps towards them. Here we are again, still making the same mistakes. Some things never do change. Salas nodded. True. I am still on the side with the most lunatics. Desalin shook his head. And you still desperately need to get laid. Cullen stared at the sentinel in utter disbelief. Next to him, Arendaw's jaw landed in the deep roads, and both of the guards were wide-eyed. Oh 4. Salas cleared his throat, and shook his head before spreading his hands. Really? Thousands of years later, you are going to start up with that again. It is not like the criticism has become less valid over the years. Desalin shrugged, and smiled innocently. Odd, Little brother. I recall you being much better with words. That is only fair, I suppose. Tissalin nodded. After all, I recall you being much more difficult to distract. He buried a knife in the first one to approach him, and flung a pouch of powder at the next. The man went down, choking and gagging. The third man removed a whip that was coiled at his waist, and sneered. You'll learn your place, rabbit. Indeed. The Magister drew his staff, and the crystal on the tip began to glow. Perhaps a lesson is dash. Metal, molten and otherwise, burst into the room as the nearby machinery exploded with enough force to send the men standing near it across the room. Those not killed by the force of the landing screamed in agony from the molten steel. A glowing figure stepped through the opening he'd just created. What the Deshbrahan stared. The term you are looking for? Earthamule smiled. Is Deus Ex Machina. Fenris was thrown backwards by the force of a spell. Gabriel whipped the blade of his staff across a man's face, opening a jagged gash. The man kept coming as though he hadn't been touched at all, and Gabriel found himself being forced back. He tried to keep himself between the attackers and his husband. A man lifted an axe, and then was sent spinning away in two different directions as a massive blade cut him in half. A crossbow bolt took another of the men in the face. I'm not sure anybody has explained this to you. Leandra Hawk stepped between the attackers and the injured Fenris. Caleb stepped out of the shadows. But fucking with Hawks is a really bad idea. Paradise laughed. You think the two of you are any threat to me? Leandra and Caleb exchanged a look. Leandra smiled and shrugged. Well, no. But then. Caleb pulled back the winch on his crossbow. We're not the dangerous ones. Have you met my boyfriend? Leandra set her blade on her shoulder. Lenore glanced at Carver, who shrugged in response. Yeah. Lenore shook her head. Not really going to let you do that. Not that he isn't capable of taking care of himself. I know. Siofra leaned on the railing. Being that he carries a shard of a god inside himself. Carver blinked. Lenore stared at him. She raised an eyebrow. What? Oh. Siofra smiled down at her. You didn't know. She made its king sound. So many secrets and lies. She waved a hand. Just a piece. A tiny piece. But. She shrugged. I need it. And unfortunately, he is not going to survive its removal. You really are on the insane side, aren't you? Carver shook his head. You've got to know what a bad idea taking me on is going to be. She smiled. Fortunately, I prepared. A hint of teeth showed. She flung something as cultists moved in from the sides. A rune landed at Carver's feet and exploded. Lenore felt a surge of power from it, and Carver cried out before falling. Carver! Lenore rushed towards him. What did you do? A mortal can take only so much power before their bodies overload. Siofra shook his head. By the time he recovers, I'll have what I need. I do regret this. She nodded to the oncoming cultists. Kill her. Lenore reached for her magic, and felt a surge from one of the men. Her magic slipped out of her grasp. Templars. Oh no. Another voice said. Templars. Whatever are we to do? A deeper voice added. Kells Marland and Trian Sedita came to either side of her, swords in hand. How many of these cultist guys have we killed this week? Kells asked Trian. I lost count somewhere around the second 100. Trian smirked. Chapter 43. The Lyrium warrior chuckled. Well, your majesty, I have good news. He turned towards Loghain. It looks like you are going to get to see the Mac tier line wiped out. Alistair scrambled backwards, trying to get back to his feet. Damn it, Loghain, get out of here. That's an order. Yeah, I've never been all that good at those. Loghain moved in. Ask anyone. He twirled his blade and tapped it against the edge of his shield. So the little king is too frightened to face me himself. The Lyrium warrior started to circle Loghain. Sticking me with the child playing at being a knight? How disappointing. I know, right? Loghain grinned. You know, I only accepted the knighthood because they promised me cake. He flicked his blade at the Lyrium warrior's face. They lied to me. He twisting, trying to strike at the shoulder of Loghain's shield arm. I'm going to crush your heart, like I did to your friend. Why the heart? Loghain blocked the blow and aimed a kick at the Lyrium warrior's knee. I mean, why not vary it up a bit? Lungs, kidneys. He parried a blow. Is it just the symbolism, or do you have some kind of fetish? The Lyrium warrior leaped back to avoid Loghain's counter-strike. What? I'm not trying to be judgmental here. Loghain set his shield. After the thing with the two dwarves and Dragon Isabella, I'm really the last person who should be judging. Irritation swept over the Lyrium warrior's face. Loghain lifted his blade for a strike, and the Lyrium warrior moved into the opening, tattoos glowing. Alistair shouted a protest as the Lyrium warrior buried his hand in Loghain's chest. Agatha grinned as she stabbed the last of the stakes into the ground. Blue light arced between the coppery rods before forming into a square barrier, caging Salas. She shook her head at Tissalin. Are we a bad influence on you, or are you a bad influence on us? 6 of one. Tissalin shrugged. And a half dozen of the other. Were, exactly, did you find ward spikes? Salas looked around him. What are ward spikes? Arendaw stared. Agatha. Colin looked at the young elven woman. He felt a chill as he realized her eyes were glowing the same as Tissalin's were. Commander, you and your companions should start moving. Tissalin frowned as if calculating something. He looked up from the copper spikes to Salas. What do you think, 4 blocks? Salas turned to look at each ward spike, and shook his head. Unless they take shelter in a building, I think about half a mile would be best. Would someone please explain what is going on? Agatha walked over to stand next to Tissalin before nodding to Colin. The ward spikes prevent any magic from going in or out. For about 5 minutes or so. She smiled. Then they explode. You're going to blow up the Dread Wolf. Arendaw's recently reattached jaw again hit the pavement. Don't worry. Tissalin shrugged. He'll be fine. No hard feelings. Agatha raised an eyebrow at Salas. A smile came to Salas's face as he shook his head. I do not think that is the part concerning them. Oh. Right. Agatha glanced back at the dumbfounded people watching. Well, nice meeting you and all. She waved at Salas before she and Tissalin turned around and leaped down over the railing. A moment later a griffin took to the air, both of them clinging to its back. You really should be running now, Commander. Salas shook his head and sighed. 5 minutes may be an overly optimistic estimate. Colin and Arendaw exchanged a look before turning to run. The guards were already moving. Earthamule. Magister Valis fell to his knees. My lord, I am not worthy. The glowing being stared at the Magister for a moment before turning to look at Bruhan. Is he serious? Why are you asking me? Bruhan stared back at him. Magister Valis pressed his forehead to the ground. The survivors of the initial blast also started falling to their knees. Are you? Earthamule tilted his head. Praying. He laughed. Oh, that is just. He stepped further into the room. Adorable. Forgive me, mighty one. The Magister actually crawled a few steps closer to Earthamule. I did not think the elf spoke truly. I crave only your blessing. My blessing. Earthamule leaned thoughtfully on his staff. You wish to hear the music. I wish only to serve your magnificence. The Magister looked up at him, nodding eagerly. Earthamule walked towards him. Perhaps we shall start with the exquisite symphony a mind makes. He set his hand on the Magister's head, and then smiled, narrowing his eyes. When it shatters. The Magister screamed and convulsed before falling to the ground and tearing at his face and eyes. Earthamule turned towards the others standing in the room. Slaves, to Tevinter and yourselves. He lifted his staff, and raised his voice. I give you freedom. He shook his head as they all started to run, and set his staff on the ground. Try to be less stupid with it, he said in a quieter voice. Fenris got back to his feet, holding his blade as he prepared to defend his husband and son. Barad raised an eyebrow at Leandra. Your dash. The entire section of the warehouse Barad was standing in suddenly lifted into the air, taking the abomination with it. Lightning swirled in the sky above them as the other parts of the city began to rise, taking most of the enemy forces with them, leaving the four of them facing. Fenris looked around. 4. Leandra. Yes, Caleb. Don't you and Gavrin ever ask me to babysit for your kids? Siofra laughed. You think the two of you are going to make that much of a difference? 2. Kels smirked. His eyes glowed faintly. Arrows rained down from above, each one taking a cultist. 4 were dead before Siofra raised her staff to expand her barrier over them, causing the next arrow to bounce off it harmlessly. Duncan landed in their midst a moment later, stabbing a cultist in the eye with an arrow before ranking it back and firing it into the chest of the next one in line. Kels and Tryan charged. Lenore stood over her unconscious cousin and lifted her staff above her head as she stared up at Siofra. The elven woman turned around and ran. Lenore shrugged, and used the butt end of her staff to smack a nearby cultist in the face. Loghain looked down at the hand sticking into his chest. He smiled, and the Lyrium warrior gave him a confused look. Nice trick. He stepped casually to the side, phasing the other man's hand through him harmlessly. What else you got? When the man's eyes widened, he called the Fade to him and sent it outwards as a burst of energy, sending the Lyrium warrior flying. How the hell did you do that? The Lyrium warrior rolled back to his feet, his hand around the hilt of Jarotha's sword. He smiled, and reached again. In war. His eyes lit as his companion joined its strength to his. Victory. The Lyrium warrior swung his blade and Loghain batted it away effortlessly. The keening blade screamed in his hand as he drove it through the Lyrium warrior's shield, armor, and heart. That's for Jaroth, you piece of shit. He yanked the blade free. The Lyrium warrior crumpled to the ground. He picked up the fallen sword and looked down at it for a moment before carrying it over to the stunned Alistair, offering it to him. Your Majesty. You. Alistair met his eyes. Then he shook his head and took the blade. Well done, and thank you. I would accompany you back, but the night is just getting started. He pointed to where part of the city had risen into the sky, and saw Alistair's eyes widen. He started to walk away, then turned back to Alistair. So, the son-in-law issue thing, No. Alistair nodded. We're good. He shrugged. I mean, as long as Wynne is happy. Thank you. Loghain saluted, and headed out of the garden. Sala landed, letting her companions disembark before returning to her human form. That went well. That isn't going to slow him down long, so let's get moving. Agatha grinned. Somewhere back in the direction they had come, something exploded. She looked back in that direction. So, how mad is he going to be now? I always found him to be a fairly good sport about such things. Tissalan shrugged. Which is not to say he is not going to be coming after us now. Well, let's let folks know where we are then. Sala twirled the coppery staff in her hand, calling up some of the power it had absorbed over the years to enhance her spell. Then she whirled and sent a blast of that power into the sky, where it lit the city as bright as day for the space of a heartbeat. Yes. Tissalan nodded. That should definitely get some attention. The glowing form bent, his fingers glowing white as he touched Burhan's leg. Burhan felt nothing as Earthamil rather casually shoved the bone back into place. I trust you can manage to get back safely. Earthamil straightened. I have far better things to do tonight than rescue you from your clumsiness. He headed back out through the massive hole he had made in the wall. Carefully, Burhan stood, slowly putting weight on the previously injured leg. It felt good as new. He shrugged, and looked up at the sky. For the record, this shit here. He shook his head, and picked up his hammer. This is why I'm an Andrastian. He headed back to Arendaw's house. For just a moment, he thought he heard someone laugh in response. The 4 men remaining didn't even last 4 seconds. You guys can get back okay, right? Caleb glanced back at his fathers, who were both again staring at the sky above them. Hawk blinked, and turned to him. You two are coming with us. Leandra shook her head. Nope, we've got an appointment elsewhere. She started walking. Yeah, by now Agatha, Sala, and Tassalin have yanked Fenharel's tail. Caleb returned the crossbow to the sling before starting to walk after Leandra. You two aren't going. Fenris cut off as a dragon with glowing green eyes landed in front of his son and niece. The massive beast lowered his neck, and both kids leaped aboard. With a beat of mighty wings, an old god took once more to the sky. Fenris. Yes, Hawk. I am starting to question our parenting skills. Starting to. Is it just me, or were they glowing? So. Kells turned towards Lenore. You're good, you can get him back safely. Lenore felt the tingling that signaled the return of her magic. Yes. She looked at their faces. I take it that means you aren't coming back with me. Duncan yanked one of his arrows free of a corpse. We've still got work to do. His eyes were cold and hard. Where are you? Lenore started to ask. Somewhere else in the city, a spell shot up into the sky, turning everything as bright as day. Sparks rained down in a shimmering shower, lighting up the top of one of the towers. Well, there's our signal. Tryan hefted his shield. Let's move. Kells headed in that direction. Lenore watched them go before she sat down next to Carver. She ruffled his hair as he started to stir. Oh cousin. She sighed. You have so much explaining to do. She drew her legs to her. Starting with why the Crown Prince of Ferelden was glowing. The dragon landed, and Leandra and Caleb slid off the neck. Magic swirled as the beast shifted back into the glowing earthamule. The glow faded from everywhere but the eyes, leaving Kieran standing there. Caleb couldn't help but wonder if his own eyes looked that cool at the moment. Kieran turned. It is done. Loghain stepped out of the shadows, light shimmering in his eyes. It's done. He nodded to Leandra. I think your boy toy is showing off a bit. You're just jealous. She grinned. Damn right. Loghain shook his head. He's got a great butt. Asshole. She shook her head affectionately before gesturing at Caleb. We're off. You boys have fun now. Caleb followed, readying his crossbow as he moved. They hadn't gone far when they saw the first group heading towards the tower. The four in the lead had horns. She grinned. Hey, hornheads. They stopped at the sound of her voice and began to turn towards her. Cadenchuk de France dim vash Eden. Ibridith reci vashito sarkalabakata. Itwaost. Caleb aimed his crossbow. Well, you got their attention. Leandra grinned before leaping down into the fray. Duncan knocked an arrow as they came upon a group rushing towards the tower. The group saw them, and the leader started to twirl a staff in their direction. A pulse of energy from Kells shut the spell down before it had firmly formed. Tryan and Kells both charged. He narrowed his eyes. Loghain hadn't been sure which mage it was, but he'd given the man his word. The arrow took the spellcaster between the eyes. If he had to get them all to be sure of killing the one responsible, then that was exactly what he was going to do. He sighted down the arrow at the next staff wielder, and fired. For a lie, Maleficar. Loghain followed Kieran into the building. Siofra stopped dead in her tracks when she saw them. The 5 men with her glanced at her nervously. Kill them. She ordered as she started moving back the direction she'd come. Loghain. He drew his blade in response, and called the Fade to him. His eyes glowed brighter. Get her. He headed towards the men, who started looking as if they wanted to be anywhere else. Kieran started after the fleeing mage. It had all gone wrong. She'd been so close, and it all had gone wrong. Siofra sliced her arm as she frantically called for her magic. He entered the room behind her. She shook her head. You don't understand. She reached for the strength in her blood. All I wanted was power. Green fire trailed from his eyes. An answer, as you called out. Begging and pleading and letting the anger fester when no one came to save you. As it has been since the dawn of time. He moved towards her. Calling and calling, wanting to be saved until nothing is left inside you but rage, desire, envy, fear, and despair. He tilted his head. And yet here you stand, living proof. Proof that it has always been within your power to save yourselves. His eyes narrowed. You called for me? He spread his hands. I have answered. Here I am. Is this not what you desired? This isn't what I wanted. She flung a spell at him. The magic washed over him as harmlessly as if she'd thrown feathers. Finally, you understand the reason for the silence. All the sacrifices I have made, and you. I remember. He was only a few feet from her, and there was nowhere left to flee. Your own baby sister, weeping as the life drained from her veins. Once. She repeated the name. Melinda. Davis. Labian. So many more whose names you did not know. Others who died from the poison of your words. He caught her by the throat. For their sake, I promise you this, Delenn. The glowing eyes whirled. For the rest of your life, you will have my undivided attention. Chapter 44. Alistair. Hawk walked towards him and immediately began to set his arm. What happened? I am still attempting to figure that out. Alistair shook his head. The Lyrium warrior is dead. My son-in-law killed him. Loghain. Fenris raised an eyebrow. Considering what has been said of the woman my daughter grows up to be. Alistair flexed the newly healed arm. I am starting to grow very concerned about the possibility of grandchildren. He nodded to Hawk. Did you find your kids? We found Leandra and Caleb. Fenris rubbed the back of his neck. Then they rode off on the back of a dragon that we are pretty sure was Earthamule. Hawk waved a hand. After Cullen's son pulled apart yet another building. Fenris shook his head. Maker's breath. Alistair shook his head. What is dash? He cut off as a half-dozen Cunari ran past their location. A heartbeat later a glowing young woman waving a massive long sword ran after them, yelling. Women don't fight my ass. Why don't you Calabaraz get over here and say that to my face? They all stood there silently for several moments. We all saw that, yes. Fenris asked. Of course, when it comes to having to be concerned about grandchildren. Alistair shook his head. I really have nothing on Cullen and Carver. Alistair. Hawk glanced at him before turning to his husband. Fenris. He gestured out at where the city was starting to explode into chaos. Our children are having fun without us. Fenris chuckled, and drew his blade. Alistair nodded and strapped the shield he'd taken off one of his dead guards to his arm. His smile was grim. Hawk twirled his staff, and grinned. Let's go show them how it's done. Brujn saw the newly summoned shade fall to the arrow before it had even finished forming. The mage Eyster who had summoned it took the next arrow through the eye. The mage behind him barely managed to turn in the direction of the archer before she too was impaled. Another mage hurled fire in the direction the arrows had come from and he saw Duncan leap into the air a heartbeat before the spell destroyed the ledge he'd been standing on. He landed on the railing of a staircase and slid down, firing arrows at the enemy mages before leaping again as he landed. The few surviving mages sent spells at Alistair's son, missing as Duncan ran across the railing of the bridge, firing arrows at them. The three remaining mages got a barrier up, and started calling up fire in their hands. Duncan ran to the edge of the bridge and leaped off into the empty air. Brujn started to shout, and then the dragon rose up from below, Duncan on his neck. A gout of fire caught the mages. From the back of an old god, soaring through the air, the Crown Prince of Ferelden fired one last arrow. It went past Brujn's head and he turned to follow it, only to see it take a man who'd been trying to sneak up on him right between the eyes. All right. Brujn nodded to himself. I'm just going to add that to the list of things about this whole mess that I am never telling Cathiel. He shrugged. I'm so glad I don't have any children. My daughter did what? Lenore stared at Cullen. Carver covered his mouth with a hand as he tried not to laugh. Blew up the dread wolf before riding off on the back of a griffin with an ancient elven warrior. Arendaw threw her hands up in the air. I have come to the conclusion that there is something deeply wrong with your children. At least we know where they are now. Carver pointed at the three towers that made up the highest point of the city. Lights in a variety of colors kept exploding at the top. Lenore waved at where torches, lights, and spells could be seen throughout the entire city. Everyone knows where they are now. It concerns me that might have been the point. Colin frowned. We should dash, he sighed. I have absolutely no strategies for this particular situation. I got one. Carver laid his blade across his shoulders. Let's go show Tevinter just where these kids get it from. He grinned before walking out of the building. Lenore laughed and followed. Colin exchanged a look with Arendelle before shrugging and heading out after them. Sala stood, focusing her magic on the barriers around her companions. She felt a tingling in the barrier around Caleb, and sent healing magic in response. On the other edge of the roof, the dragon landed. Duncan leapt lightly to the ground. Agatha and Tessalin immediately leapt onto the dragon's back and it took off again. Duncan refreshed his quiver before heading to the edge of the roof and looking down at the people starting to cross the bridge. He nocked an arrow and fired, pinning a magister's head to a nearby statue. The people on the bridge started to scatter and run. Near a fountain on the streets below he saw enemy forces trying to regroup. He concentrated, forming the map in his head. The dragon roared, and down below he saw the forms of Kells and Tryan adjust their trajectory. Status. Everyone up, everyone moving. Sala reported back. Instinctively she strengthened the barrier on Leandra before directing healing energy into Loghain. Your fathers and mine have joined the fight. He nodded at where fire suddenly appeared on one of the streets below. They seem to be doing some damage. I'll bet. She grinned fiercely. Her eyes closed as she drew upon the energy of the staff again. The workings were starting to make a notable dent in the power it had built up, and its ambient glow was starting to darken. With her eyes closed, she could almost see the map Duncan was creating for her companions, and wondered for a moment if this was what it was like for her Uncle Carver. Part of the map glowed for a moment, and she felt Kieran, Agatha, and Tessalin diving in that direction. They made the short work of the first group of enemy combatants they'd encountered. Colin was leading Lenore and Carver towards part of a fray when they heard a sharp whistle and looked up to see Tryan. He was waving at a group running up the street. Hey, Vince, your mothers are all rock lickers. The dwarf added a rude gesture before ducking under cover. The group started towards him. Shit. Lenore started heading in to rescue the dwarf. The enemy forces came around the corner, fire starting to appear the hands of the mages. Kells and Loghain leapt down from the roof above, landing in their midst. The fire vanished in a pulse of energy a heartbeat before Kells took the head off one of the mages. Loghain cut the other in half. Tryan came out of his hiding place and charged, bowling two others over. Loghain and Kells stood back to back, and the Tevinter were down mere moments later. Lieutenant. Colin stared. The eyes of his attaché were glowing. And so, for that matter, were Tryan and Loghain's. Just as Agatha and Tessalin's had been earlier. Kells saluted. Commander. When did you become a Templar? Tryan and Kells exchanged a look, and Kells shrugged. About an hour ago, give or take a few minutes. What are you kids? Lenore started to ask. The three young men turned westward at the same time. Loghain shook his head. Can't talk now, Leandra found a party. They all jumped down what had to be a 30-foot drop, landing easily before running off. Lenore and Colin both turned towards Carver. Carver chuckled. Remember when you asked how a dozen wardens could take on the entire Cunary vanguard in a single evening? But. Lenore shook her head. But you had. Her eyes widened. Kieran is at a fraction of his power. Maker's breath. Colin shook his head. The kids have the staff. And if we've figured that out, safe bet the Dread Wolf has too. Lenore growled. Well, hopefully they draw Barad eyes out before the wolf catches them. Carver started towards the tower again. Or this is going to get really messy. For Tevinter. A group started to charge at Hawk's party. Form a berry. Another voice yelled, and Agatha Amel leapfrogged over one of the group, twisting his helmet to blind him, before heading down an alley. The entire group immediately switched directions to pursue her. Hawk immediately raced after them, followed by Alistair and Fenris. Agatha came to a stop in the blind alley, turned, and grinned at her pursuers. One sneered. "Bad move, little dash." Enchanted swords came to life as another elf appeared in the midst of the Tevinter forces. Agatha drew her own knives and leapt into the fray as Tissalin's blades began to dance, whirling faster than the eyes could follow. Agatha moved as if she knew exactly where his blades were going to be, darting in and out to slice open the few that managed to dodge the ancient's warriors' attacks. The last of the Tevinter forces fell before Hawk could even get a spell off. "What the?" Fenris said. "Imagine." Tissalin looked towards Agatha. "These people actually believe they defeated the Elven Empire." He made its king sound under his breath. "Boggles the mind, really." Agatha shrugged. The two of them leaped into the air, grabbed ledges, and were running across the rooftops again a few heartbeats later. Alistair turned to look at Hawk. "They did say in the future, she works for my son, right?" "Yep. Good to know." He frowned. "I am not sure which possibility concerns me more." Fenris frowned thoughtfully. "Possibility?" Hawk turned towards his husband. "I am attempting to decide whether or not the children actually have anything resembling a plan." Hawk casually flung a fireball at a small group starting to draw weapons and come towards them. "I see your point. Bruhan. Bahallan." The sentinel glanced at him before gestured at the city below. "The children have apparently declared war on Tevinter." They stood for a few minutes, watching Leandra taunt a group into coming after her, only for a shot from Caleb's crossbow to strike a rune someone had stuck on the nearby wall, causing it to explode. Leandra went through the few survivors like shale in a pigeon coop. Bruhan turned to look at Bahallan. "A war they appear to be winning. I no longer feel quite so bad about having been captured by them." Bahallan gave a small chuckle. "Yeah." Bruhan nodded. "Same here." He shrugged. "You know, I passed what I'm thinking may have been a bar on the way up here. Such a thing would certainly seem to warrant further investigation." Bahallan nodded. They turned and headed back down the stairs. Beneath them, the entire city was awake. Those who were neutral or innocent were trying to get as far away from the chaos as possible. The enemy forces, drawn or herded by the actions of their companions, were converging on the tower. Duncan saw a small band of sentinels crossing the bridge, and sent an arrow. It pierced the head of one and continued into the stomach of the man behind him. "I think we have everyone's attention now." He tugged slightly, and felt the dragon move in response, diving to collect some of the others. A few of the enemy forces had tried to take their own positions atop towers. Towers which were currently in flames. He smiled fiercely. A high dragon was dangerous enough on its own. Add a mind that had been tutored by a couple of the greatest generals Ferelden had ever produced, and one had an unstoppable force even without throwing in the old god bit. His general should be here. "You're doing fine." Sala smiled at him reassuringly. It took him a couple seconds to realize he hadn't said the words out loud. Lenore caught sight of Alistair's group, and gestured to her companions. "I don't suppose any of you know what is going on." She sent a wave of ice over a group attempting to charge in their direction. "Such as where all these people are coming from. Cunnery. Crows. Cultists. Various Tevinter factions. Spotted some Carta." Cullen frowned. "Actually, the only group I haven't seen." He shook his head. "No, there they are." He pointed at a group charging up a nearby staircase. They wore Orlshian-style armor. "Well, at least there are no dash." Carver cut off as a pride demon came around the corner. "Oh come on, I hadn't even said it yet." Hawk whacked him on the back of the head. "You should have known better than to even think it." "Has anyone seen Bruhan?" Alistair asked as he drew his blade. Chapter 45. Alistair reached the top of the tower only a half pace ahead of Cullen. He saw Duncan put a flame-covered arrow into a despair demon, and a moment later saw Kells almost casually fling a man in Orlshian armor off the roof. A terror demon started towards them, and he and Alistair exchanged only the barest glance before moving forward to meet it. On the other side of the roof, a pride demon appeared in response to a mage's summons. Hawk and Fenris started in that direction only for the dragon to grab both demon and mage and hurl both into the city below. The dragon turned on a wing and started back in their direction. The dragon is on our side, right? Alistair asked. Maker, I certainly hope so. Cullen yanked his blade out of the terror demon as it started to disintegrate. Men with swords started towards where Sala was standing, and the dragon landed, shifting into the form of a tall young man. Lightning crackled around Kieran like a miniature storm as he began hurling spells. And then the remaining attackers atop the roof abruptly turned to statues of white stone. Cullen turned to see Salas, with 20 sentinels and twice again as many Dalish warriors accompanying him. The Dread Wolf looked around the rooftop. The children were starting to turn in his direction. Leandra set her blade point down in front of her. Kells and Trian both set folded arms atop their shields. Weapons of steel and light vanished from the hands of Tessalin and Agatha. Duncan slung his bow back over his shoulder as Caleb did the same with the crossbow. Loghain leaned on the remains of what had been some kind of statue. Kieran and Sala laid their staffs on their shoulders. Fenharil. Kieran nodded politely. I think this has gone on quite long enough. Salas shook his head as he walked towards them, flanked by his agents. He turned towards Sala. I will be taking the staff. Sala smiled. What staff? I believe I have shown considerable patience thus far, Delenn. Salas narrowed his eyes. Do not try me further. I believe that is a threat. Kieran glanced at Sala. Was that a threat? It sounded like a threat. Sala nodded. I mean, I am definitely feeling a bit threatened. He does have us outnumbered. Duncan called from where he was standing. With elves even. Agatha added. Maybe we should hand it over. Loghain wiped blood from his sword. I mean, they do have a god on their side and everything. Caleb waved a hand. His jaw dropped when Sala nodded, and casually threw the staff to Salas. The Dread Wolf caught it easily, and Sala smiled. No hard feelings, right? Salas stared down at the staff in his hand. He turned it this way and that, eyes narrowing. This. He shook his head, and looked up at Kieran. You sacrificed the last of the Sulanven for this. It is a very good staff. Kieran nodded. I can attest to that. Sala smiled. Best I've ever used. But the answer to your question is no. Kieran shrugged. This is ridiculous. Salas shook his head. Baradize is still loose in the city. Did you even have a PLA? He cut himself off as he looked around the rooftop. With a start, Cullen realized just who was missing. Copper in the air. Tessalon's lips twitched. Where is Gavrin? Salas and Cullen asked simultaneously. Copper drops. Agatha grinned. Sala leaned into Kieran, and felt his arm go around her. Across the roof, her fathers and the others were staring. The Dread Wolf handed the staff to the sentinel next to him. What game are you playing? Well. Duncan spoke from where he was standing. We started trying to come up with a plan, and Caleb made a pretty good point. Having a plan would give you the opportunity to disrupt it. Caleb nodded. So we decided to just do what we do best. Leandra chuckled. Go with our strengths and all. Agatha nodded. And then Kells made a very good point. Kieran gestured at the man. The Inquisition's strength lies in finding the right people and giving them the right tools. Delegation and all. Kells nodded. Loghain spoke up. So we asked ourselves, what happens when you take the most powerful mage in Thedas? Let the god of inspiration boost him further. Tessalin folded his arms. Kieran smiled. And then hand him an ancient elven foci. The orb hovered above his hand, responding to his will. The formless one had abandoned the host body that had served it. The vibrations of the veil shrieked as Gavrin strengthened it, preventing the demon from fleeing back across. It shifted as it ran, and dove down a grate into the city's underlevels. Hunting through the labyrinthine catacombs would take more time than remained. Gavrin focused his magic. Nearby a tower suddenly tore free of the ground as an unseen force picked it up and moved it outside the city walls, leaving a jagged opening in the heart of the city. The sky broke open as boulders started to rain down in that area. Looks like the answer is, rocks fall, everything dies. Traian shrugged. Seconds passed while everyone just stared. All of this was purely a distraction. Salas shook his head. Creating enough chaos that I would not be able to track Gavrin. Hey, a lot of those folks were legitimately trying to kill us. Leandra glared. Or capture us. Traian glanced at her. Or make us go to bed without dinner. Loghain shrugged. You. Alistair gave them a disbelieving look. Your plan was not to have a plan so you could trick the Dread Wolf. Ah, audacity. Kieran smiled. There truly is no greater refuge. Salas actually laughed. Incredible. He is manipulating the veil across the entire city. You always were an excellent teacher. Tissalan leaned back against the remains of a pillar to watch the chaos below. Want to know the best part? Kieran waited until Salas turned towards him before continuing. You will not remember this. His smile showed teeth. But I will. The part of the tower Salas was standing on suddenly broke free of the building and went hurtling through the air. The forces that had come with Salas stared and shook. Kieran twisted his staff, dividing it into a sword and axe combination. Duncan notched an arrow to his bowstring. Loghain and Leandra both laid their blades on their shoulders. Caleb just shrugged, and grinned at the group of elves. So, who'd like their asses kicked first? Gavrin felt someone trying to wrest control of the wreckage from him. He brought it level with the piece upon which he stood, and stared across at his teacher. Harin. Delenn. Salas looked back at him, and his eyes went to the orb Gavrin held. I am beginning to get an inkling of why I put so much effort into training you. The future, Gavrin smiled, is going to be an interesting place. Agreed. Salas's eyes flashed. Power hit the barrier Gavrin had formed around himself, and lightning splattered across the sky. He drew upon the orb, on the power Earthamil had loaned him. And then he threw the Dread Wolf clear of the city that bore his name. The Formless One shifted desperately, shifting from desire to envy to pride to despair as it continued trying to hide. It ripped and tore at the veil as it fled, and he healed the damage before it could create an opening big enough to pass or pull other demons through. Then there it was, right before his eyes. He closed the barrier as it frantically tried to escape. Gavrin smiled as he called forth the magic, drawing deep from the wellspring in his hand. The Formless One ceased to exist. Chapter 46. Siofra was examining the scroll the abomination had given her when she heard the front door open. Immediately, she gestured to Padar. His tattoos glowed lightly as he started across the room to investigate. He'd made it halfway when the door to their room opened and a tall, handsome young man entered. Siofra narrowed her eyes. Who are you and what are you doing in here? You hurt my friends. He tilted his head at her. That is unacceptable. The face of her spirit companion's host twisted into a smirk. Siofra rolled her eyes. Padar, get his name before you kill him. Padar took 2 steps forward before the young man waved a hand and Padar flew backwards across the room. His smoking corpse came to a stop at her feet. Her mouth opened as she stared. Next to her, Barad started to flee and ran into a barrier. His form began shifting and trying to move in all directions at once, making a panicked noise. My name. The young man's eyes started to glow. Is Earthamil. Kirkwall is honored by your presence. Sala blinked, and rubbed at her eyes. She was standing in the chantry, and her father was up on the dais, giving a speech to the divine. Sala. Agatha put a hand on her shoulder. Are you all right? I. Sala turned, and rushed down the hall, only dimly aware Agatha was following her. She stopped a few paces from the room that contained the kids, and heard laughter within. Sala, what's wrong? Agatha caught her arm. I just. Sala took a deep breath. I need to be sure. She nodded politely to the Templars at the door, and they nodded in recognition before letting her pass. She stepped into the room, and saw Leandra dragging the slightly smaller Gavrin into the garden. The faces of both children were smeared with something, and they were laughing madly. Loghain had found himself a quiet corner, and had his nose stuck in a book. Duncan was sitting at a table, apparently being annoyed by a girl a year or two younger who was trying to get him to play some kind of dice game. And then her eyes fell on the older boy, red hair just a shade or two darker than orange, standing by the bookshelf, watching them play. She smiled, and walked over to him. He looked up, and gave her a small bow, stumbling slightly when he noticed Agatha behind her. Lady Hawke. He swallowed. Lady Amel. General Gilmore. She smiled. Keeping an eye on everyone for us. He turned slightly red at the title. Yes, ma'am. Impulsively, she reached out and tousled his hair. You and Duncan have to be bored sitting in here. She glanced at Agatha. Why don't you come with Agatha and we'll go see if Varric put any secret passages anywhere. Duncan nearly knocked the chair over in his haste to get away from the table. Really? Fenris found his daughter sitting in the balcony, as she had done every evening since the chantry dedication. Sala. He sat next to her. What's wrong? She leaned into him. I don't know if I can even explain it. He put an arm around her. Try. She sighed. Waiting. I thought. She shook her head. What if? Sala. She hugged her arms around herself. Or maybe it was just a dream, I don't know. She turned towards him. Has Papa ever considered writing Sebastian back? What? He blinked. What brought that question? It's been a lot of years. They used to be good friends and... She looked up at the newly rebuilt chantry. Sometimes the past needs to be let go. Is this about your guardsmen? What guards? She laughed. Oh, I haven't given Veluk a thought in months. Well, that's... He raised an eyebrow. Good. He shifted to look at her. Did you meet someone at the dedication? Yes. And no. And yes. That clarifies everything. I expected him to be here by now. She looked up at the night sky, and sighed wistfully. Maybe I should carve snowflakes. He followed her gaze up to the stars as he tried to figure just how and when the conversation had turned strange. Sala. I'm all right. She snuggled into him. I'm just watching the stars, if you want to help. I can do that. Kells fastened the collar and wrinkled his nose. He saw the commander shake his head slightly. You do not have to attend. Minov has been dropping hints about dancing. Kells sighed. Rather large ones. Cullen nodded. Well, Lieutenant, I will leave the dancing to you then. Represent the Inquisition well. Wait. What? He started to turn towards the commander, and caught sight of Minov coming down the stairs dressed in flowing robes of yellow. She smiled before greeting him with a kiss. Are you ready? He managed a noise that vaguely resembled an affirmative before offering her his arm. Leliana handed Bruhin a small stack of papers before turning to the Inquisitor. Are you going to be staying in Kirkwall much longer? Ruya shook her head. Just another week. I'm leaving Iron Bull a while longer. Dorian is still conducting negotiations. Leliana shook her head and smiled. Speaking of which, I thought perhaps I would drop by for some additional negotiations after the feast. Bruhin tucked the papers away. Oh, 4. Ruya buried her face in her hand as they laughed. You realize I'm never going to be able to use that word again now. Speaking of the feast, we should be getting back. Leliana turned towards the door. The door opened, and 4 men in the robes of Chantry brothers entered. Leliana was starting to run towards them when she heard Ruya call her name. Bruhin was reacting immediately, going for his weapon as magic appeared around the hands of the newcomers. And then abruptly there were 4 neat piles of ash on the ground. A tall, handsome young man stepped in the door. Ah! Inquisitor, Divine Victoria, Spymaster Bruhin. He frowned, and looked around him in confusion. Could you tell me what day today is? Bruhin glanced at Leliana before answering. Thursday. When the young man continued looking at him blankly, he added, the 12th of Kingsway. The 12th. The young man blinked. Bother. And now I'm late. He abruptly turned into a hawk and flew out the window. They stood there for a minute. What just happened? Ruya asked. From the direction of the feast, they heard the sound of shouting, and all three of them headed that way at a dead run. Gabriel sent a blast of fire into the newly summoned demon. Varric, this is the last time I let you make the guest list. Next to him, Fenris's sword of mercy opened to whoever these people were from throat to navel. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw his daughter put up a barrier, keeping a shade from getting to the children she'd gathered to her. Who are these guys? Varric asked. A pride demon appeared, and started for the guests cowering behind a table. A mage started to call up another spell. A hawk came in through the open window and landed in the center of the room, turning into a tall young man as it did so. The young man, surrounded by an aura of green fire, lifted a coppery staff above his head and slammed it into the ground, sending a wave of energy washing through the room. The demons and blood mages turned abruptly to dust. Silence descended. The fire vanished from around the mage. The divine entered, followed by the inquisitor and spymaster. They looked at the scene before them. What? The divine started to speak. And then his daughter was striding across the room. She shoved the newly arrived mage. You're late. No. He shook his head. I checked. This was definitely the nick of time. Gabriel felt his jaw unhinge as his daughter threw her arms around the man's neck, kissing him soundly. The mage put his own arms around her and swung her around in a circle as he returned the kiss. Salah released Kiran, and shook her head. What took you so long? It is very difficult to enter an unknown symphony at exactly the right moment. Kiran caressed her cheek. I had to go back several days in order to stop the cult from getting to the ruins while Melavin's group was there. Her eyes widened. You saved Anara. She stood on her tiptoes to kiss him again. Of course I saved Anara. He blinked at her. And then I was too early, so I went to Nessum, and then I was still too early, so I tried hopping forwards, but I went a measure too far. Making you late. She nodded. I could try going back part of a verse and... Kiran. She shook her head at him. Stop messing with the time-space continuum. She kissed him again. Yes. He smiled. Would you like to go have dinner with me? She smiled. Where? Starkhaven. He took her hand. There are some people there we need to meet again. Leliana stared as Hawk's daughter and the young man abruptly turned into hawks and flew away. She turned towards where Hawk was standing, and saw similar confusion on the faces of both him and Fenris. Does anyone know who that was? Yes. Carver Hawk nodded. Well. I'm not entirely sure what just happened. Carver rubbed the back of his neck. But that was Kiran. Wait. Alistair turned towards him. That was the warden's kid. Why was my daughter kissing him? Fenris raised an eyebrow at Carver. Yeah, I have absolutely no idea. Hawk budged one of the corpses with his foot. Do we even know who these guys were? Duncan's voice piped up. Hey, that was the crazy mage from Dark Town. Ruya sat in her husband's lap, and looked across the bar at Carver. Let me see if I have this straight. She took a deep breath. Your niece just flew off with an old god. Yes. Next to him, Hawk shook his head. So you are saying my daughter just turned into a bird and flew off with an old god? Yes. The divine pinched the bridge of her nose. How many times are we going to have to repeat it before it starts making sense? Burhan sighed. I need a drink. A bottle slid down the bar, and he caught it. Thank Dash he turned in the direction it had come from and cut off abruptly. Jarathtabri leaned on the other end of the bar. I was just informed I've acquired a daughter-in-law. He looked at all of them. Anyone care to explain? Check the description for the links to the author.